The Edwardian era, stretching from 1901 to 1910, was a peculiar slice of time sandwiched between the strict buttoned-up Victorians and the chaotic whirl of the First World War. Named after King Edward VII, this short decade sparkled with glamour, grandeur, and a desperate obsession with appearances. To put it bluntly, if you weren't dazzling someone with your perfectly powdered face or towering hairdo, were you even living? This was the age of the gilded lily, a society where wealth wasn't whispered about but shouted from every feathered hat, velvet gown and pearl necklace. The upper classes believed appearances were everything, and the cosmetic craze was no longer an underground practice. What had once been scorned as immoral or scandalous in Victorian times was slowly being reframed as fashionable, provided you didn't look like you were trying too hard. In other words, yes, you could paint your face, but heaven help you if anyone noticed you were doing it. Hello, travelers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. The Edwardians were masters of contradiction. They wanted beauty to look effortless, but it often required 2 hours, 6 powders, and a prayer. They adored naturalness, but only if it came from a jar. And while cosmetics had long been associated with actresses, courtesans, or ladies of questionable virtue, this era elevated makeup to the realm of the respectable, if done with a delicate hand. The goal was to achieve that perfect balance where your cheeks said, "I've just had a brisk country walk," rather than, "I've just dunked my head into a paint bucket." But cosmetics weren't just about vanity. They were about status. A pale, unblemished complexion told the world you didn't toil in fields or work in factories. You had time to lounge in drawing rooms or be whisked away to country estates. Your worth wasn't measured by your soul. It was measured by how much powder fell off your face when you sneezed. Beauty wasn't merely skin deep. It was a declaration of class, wealth, and quite frankly, smugness. To understand the craze, you have to understand the beauty ideal of the time. This was the age of the Gibson girl, an illustrated figure by American artist Charles Dana Gibson that quickly spread across the Atlantic. She was tall, poised, with a swan-like neck, flushed cheeks, and hair piled into a massive pompadour that looked like it could host a family of starlings. The Gibson girl wasn't real, of course. She was a cartoon, but real Edwardian women were expected to live up to her impossible standards. Imagine trying to embody an Instagram filter in real life, only instead of Photoshop you had cold cream and arsenic wafers. The Gibson girl embodied independence, youth, and vitality, all wrapped in an aura of unattainable grace. She was both modern and traditional, intelligent enough to read the newspapers, but delicate enough to faint if she didn't eat her cucumber sandwich on time. And so, cosmetics became the tools to help real women sculpt themselves into this fantasy figure, subtly, discreetly, and always with the appearance of being natural. It's worth noting just how radical this shift was. For centuries, society looked down on makeup as deceitful, immoral, or downright scandalous. To paint one's face was to invite gossip, judgment, and accusations of questionable morals. Queen Victoria herself had famously declared makeup vulgar, yet by the time Edward VII took the throne, attitudes had softened. This wasn't entirely because society suddenly became progressive. Rather, cosmetics were being cleverly rebranded, not as paint but as enhancements, not as vanity but as hygiene. After all, who could argue with a lady wanting to look fresh or refined? This shift was helped along by marketing. Cosmetic companies began presenting their powders and creams not as sinful masks but as respectable tools of self-care. Advertisements promised refinement, youthfulness, and elegance, concepts even the strictest moralist had difficulty objecting to. By renaming makeup as complexion aids or beautifying lotions, companies smuggled them into boudoirs and bathroom cabinets across the land. For Edwardian women, beauty wasn't just personal. It was practically patriotic. To maintain your looks was to reflect your family's status, your husband's wealth, and your country's refinement. Looking disheveled was a social faux pas on par with burping at a royal dinner. Women were judged not only on their dresses and jewels, but on the perfection of their skin, hair, and overall polish. And with society's rigid hierarchies, cosmetics were both a mask and a weapon. A powdered face wasn't simply about looking good, it was about controlling the narrative of who you were. A flawless complexion could suggest noble breeding, even if your ancestors were actually potato farmers. A carefully rouged cheek might suggest youth and vitality, even if you felt more like a deflated sofa. Cosmetics gave Edwardian women a kind of silent power, a way to play the game of appearances in a society where appearances ruled everything. Of course, there was irony in all this. To achieve effortless beauty required endless effort, and to look natural required quite a bit of unnatural intervention. Women spent time, money, and patience chasing ideals that weren't real, but they also reveled in it. The Edwardian era, with its lavish balls, garden parties, and drawing room teas, was a stage, and cosmetics were the costume. If the Victorian woman was supposed to embody piety, modesty, and restraint, the Edwardian woman was allowed to dazzle. She was expected to be elegant, glowing, and above all, pleasing to the eye. The Edwardians didn't just flirt with beauty, they went full romance. So when we set the stage for the Edwardian era, we're stepping into a world where beauty wasn't a personal choice. It was a civic duty, a performance, and sometimes a gamble with dangerous powders. A world where elegance was demanded, extravagance was praised, and appearances mattered more than anything. And remember, if you weren't leaving a trail of face powder behind you, were you even fashionable? If there was one piece of furniture that summed up the Edwardian era's obsession with beauty, it wasn't the dining table or even the writing desk. It was the vanity table. This wasn't just a surface for holding brushes and bottles. Oh no. The Edwardian vanity table was a stage, a shrine, and occasionally a battlefield, where women waged war against freckles, wrinkles, and the terrifying possibility of looking ordinary. In wealthy households, the vanity table stood proudly in a lady's boudoir, the ultimate symbol of refinement. Often crafted from polished mahogany or gleaming satin wood, it wasn't just functional, it was art. Mirrors, sometimes tripled for maximum angle checking power, allowed a woman to examine herself like a jewel under inspection. Drawers overflowed with powders, rouge pots, lotions, creams, combs, and mysterious bottles with labels like Youth Restorer or Complexion Tonic. The table wasn't just furniture, it was a performance space where beauty rituals unfolded daily, like a play that always ended with a powdered nose and carefully pinned curls. To step up to the Edwardian vanity was to enter a sacred ritual. Imagine the hush of the boudoir, the filtered daylight bouncing off the polished mirror, and rows of gleaming jars catching the light. If Victorian bedrooms had crucifixes, Edwardian bedrooms had rouge pots. Imagine a shrine, but instead of candles for saints, it's rouge pots for cheeks. Every brushstroke, every dab of powder was part of the performance. Wealthy women didn't just get ready, they curated themselves, like living artworks. The process was elaborate, precise, and very often exhausting, but exhaustion didn't matter. You weren't supposed to look tired when you walked downstairs for tea. The vanity table existed to erase evidence that you were a mere mortal who needed sleep. What exactly cluttered these shrines? A dizzying collection of tools, ornate ivory combs, silver-handled brushes, pumice stones for smoothing roughness, eyebrow tweezers, often mistaken for medieval torture devices, and tiny glass jars of creams and powders. Some women even kept little silver spoons, no, not for tea, but for scooping just the right amount of powder without contaminating the jar. Because heaven forbid your powder absorb yesterday's imperfections. Then there were perfume atomizers, designed to spray fragrance in the most dramatic way possible. It wasn't enough to dab a drop behind your ears. No, you needed a bulb pump that hissed like a snake, releasing a fine mist so you could bathe yourself in essence of roses while also making the maid sneeze uncontrollably. Of course, not everyone had a vanity table. This was a luxury of the upper and middle classes. a sign that you had both the means and the leisure to indulge in beautification rituals. Working women might keep a single tin of powder tucked away discreetly, but the grand vanity table with its gleaming surface and clutter of luxuries was a rich woman's domain. The very existence of such a table declared, "I have so much free time, I can dedicate an entire piece of furniture to my face." For middle-class women aspiring upward, owning a vanity table was as much about status as cosmetics. It meant you were part of the beauty conversation, even if your rouge pots were cheaper imitations of what duchesses used. Vanity tables were like social ladders in wood and glass. Climb one drawer at a time. The vanity table turned daily grooming into theatre. A lady's maid often acted as both stagehand and audience, fetching creams, arranging powders, and handing over brushes while admiring the transformation. If you think modern influencers invented the concept of an entourage helping someone get ready, think again. Edwardian mistresses had been rehearsing that act long before social media existed. And don't underestimate the psychological power of these rituals. Sitting before the mirror wasn't just about fixing flaws, it was about preparing for battle. A powdered face wasn't just pale, it was armor. A carefully arranged hairstyle wasn't just fashionable, it was a crown. By the time a woman rose from her vanity, she wasn't simply dressed, she was armed with beauty. The vanity table was more than personal, it was political. In Edwardian culture, everything was about appearances, and appearances began here. A perfectly arranged vanity spoke of wealth, taste, and refinement. Guests rarely saw it, but they knew it existed. Just as a dining room proclaimed a family's ability to host, a vanity table proclaimed a lady's ability to embody grace and elegance. For men, furniture might symbolize power through utility. Massive desks, heavy bookcases, clubs filled with leather chairs. For women, the vanity was their throne, their desk, their command center. While Edwardian society limited female power in politics or business, the boudoir remained a space of control. A woman could dictate her appearance if nothing else. Perhaps the most fascinating element of the Edwardian vanity was its double-edged nature. It represented both truth and illusion. On one hand, it was about grooming, brushing hair, cleaning skin, maintaining health. On the other, it was about constructing a version of oneself that was palatable to society. The powders and rouge weren't just about beauty, they were about survival in a culture obsessed with appearances. One can almost imagine an Edwardian lady leaning into her mirror, whispering, "Is this me, or the me they want me to be?" before carefully dusting on her powder, and then sneezing, creating a white cloud that settled over the carpet like a snowstorm of vanity. The rise of the vanity table wasn't just a fad, it was a symbol of a changing world, where cosmetics were shifting from the shadows into the spotlight. It showed that beauty was no longer an accident of birth, but a daily performance that could be crafted, polished, and perfected. In Edwardian society, to sit at your vanity was to step into character, to play the part expected of you. And while it may look like just a table with a mirror, in 1905 it was much more. It was the altar of self-invention, the sacred space where jars of powder, pots of rouge, and vials of scent gave women the illusion of control in a world that rarely allowed them any. Because in Edwardian England your face wasn't just your face, it was your resume, your introduction, your legacy, and your vanity table was the office where it was written, one powder puff at a time. If there was one beauty obsession that ruled the Edwardian age with an iron fist wrapped in lace, it was the pursuit of pale skin. Nothing screamed elegance louder than a face untouched by the sun, glowing with the fragile delicacy of porcelain that looked as though it might chip if you sneezed too hard. To be pale was to be refined, genteel, and enviably free from anything resembling labor. A tan didn't mean I've been to the Riviera, the way it might later in the 20th century. No, a tan meant you were a farmhand. You shoveled hay, you worked outside, and in Edwardian society, that was the very last thing a lady wanted people to think. Pale skin wasn't just fashionable, it was shorthand for class. The aristocracy and the wealthy had long relied on this visual signal to set themselves apart. While the working classes toiled under the sun, their faces burned and browned. The upper classes lounged indoors, shielded by parasols, wide-brimmed hats, and the comforting presence of a maid who could be blamed for any exposure to the outdoors. To look pale was to broadcast. I have never lifted a finger in my life except perhaps to ring a bell for tea. In other words, pallor was a form of conspicuous consumption. Of course, the problem with chasing a ghost-like complexion is that nature rarely cooperates. The English sun may not be as merciless as its Mediterranean cousin, but it was still capable of leaving its mark, especially on those who insisted on spending afternoons in Edwardian gardens, pretending to faint over poetry. That's where cosmetics stepped in with promises of miracle cures. Whitening creams, powders and tonics filled vanity tables across the country, all claiming to restore the delicate lily-white glow that high society demanded. But these creams and powders were not the innocent jars of moisturizer you might imagine. Many were concocted with ingredients that modern dermatologists would classify as lawsuits waiting to happen. Zinc oxide was a common base which at least had the benefit of providing coverage, though it left the user with a chalky mask that flaked if you dared to smile. Then there was bismuth, which gave the skin a gleaming, almost pearlescent quality. Unfortunately, it also caused rashes and made some women itch so badly they looked like they had fleas. And let's not forget the heavy hitters, lead-based powders and mercury-laced creams, both of which worked wonders at bleaching skin while quietly poisoning the user. The good news? You looked delicate. The bad news? Your skin glowed like a haunted lampshade. Yet danger rarely discouraged the Edwardians. In fact, many women applied these treatments religiously, slathering them on day after day in pursuit of the coveted look. Recipes for homemade concoctions circulated, with women boiling lemon juice, mixing vinegar with milk, or even rubbing on buttermilk in the belief that sour dairy could somehow strip away freckles. Imagine smelling like expired yogurt while insisting it was for refinement. Beauty required sacrifices, and in the Edwardian age, those sacrifices often included your health, your dignity, and your ability to stand in the sun without crumbling into dust. Freckles were another sworn enemy of the pale complexion. Entire industries sprouted up around freckle removers, most of them dubious at best. Ads promised instant clarity, smooth refinement, and spotless complexions, but the reality was closer to blotchy skin and lingering regret. Still, freckles were stigmatized as telltale signs of sun exposure, and therefore of labor, and no self-respecting lady wanted that association. Better to risk irritation than risk someone thinking you'd ever held a shovel. This obsession wasn't only about creams and powders, it also shaped behavior. Edwardian women took sun avoidance to an art form. Parasols became essential accessories, carried with the same devotion as handbags. Gloves weren't just a fashion statement. They were a way to keep one's hands pristine, free from the betrayal of sun-darkened skin. Hats expanded to almost comical proportions, with wide brims that could shade not just the face but half the street. If a woman happened to step outside uncovered, she wasn't just risking a tan, she was risking her social reputation. Pale skin was a constant performance, and the world was the audience. And here's the irony. Despite all the effort to look like fragile porcelain, the reality of Edwardian life meant women were still human. Their cheeks flushed when they walked too briskly, their noses reddened in the cold. Their faces betrayed their age, no matter how many layers of powder they applied. But the obsession with pallor persisted, because it was never about health or reality. It was about fantasy, about creating an image so delicately perfect that it erased all evidence of the messy, inconvenient truth of being alive. What's fascinating is how this obsession with pallor set the stage for a cultural reversal later in the century. By the 1920s, bronze skin would become the new badge of wealth and leisure, signaling that you could afford beach holidays and cruises. But in the Edwardian decade, the pale look reigned supreme. It was a sign that you were untouched, unspoiled, and untanned, a delicate flower sheltered from the grubby world. Whether you achieved that look through careful parasol choreography or by smearing your face with substances better suited for a chemistry lab didn't matter. What mattered was the illusion. In the end, the Edwardian obsession with pale skin reveals more than just a beauty trend. It shows how appearances could dictate identity, how skin itself became a battleground for class and respectability. It also shows how willing people were to gamble with danger for the sake of fashion. After all, nothing says elegance quite like poisoning yourself slowly in the name of refinement. If the pale complexion was the Edwardian woman's canvas, rouge was the brushstroke that brought the portrait to life. But rouge had a complicated history, particularly in Britain, where it carried the faint whiff of scandal long before the Edwardian decade dusted it off and declared it chic again. Victorian morality had shunned rouge as a deceitful trick of painted women, a phrase that did not, in their minds, mean glamorous art models, but rather ladies whose business involved more mattress and less marriage. To wear red on your cheeks was to invite whispers, suspicion, and possibly a lecture from your grandmother. And yet, by the early 1900s, rosy cheeks staged a triumphant comeback. They were no longer a sign of sin, they were a fashionable flourish. This was more than a cosmetic change. It was a cultural rebellion against the rigid, austere aesthetic of the Victorians. The Edwardians wanted life, energy, and colour. They wanted to look alive, not embalmed. A face that was pale without rouge risked appearing sickly, or worse, dull. But dust on some rouge and suddenly you weren't dying of consumption. You were simply brimming with health, vitality, and questionable chemistry. Your cheeks didn't say, "I'm healthy." They screamed, "I just lost a boxing match with a rose bush." The methods of achieving this rose-tinted look varied, and here's where things get entertaining. The more traditional women swore by natural methods, pinching the cheeks before entering a drawing room, for example. A quick squeeze was supposed to stimulate blood flow, leaving you flushed with what looked like natural vitality. The problem, of course, was that the flush usually lasted as long as a sneeze. Enter crushed beet juice, a folk method beloved by resourceful women who either distrusted store-bought products or couldn't afford them. A dab of beetroot could stain the cheeks a fetching red, though it also had a tendency to drip, smear, and leave you looking as though you'd been attacked by your salad. Then there were the chemists who took rouge to new heights and depths. By the Edwardian period, chemically prepared rouge were widely available, sold in little pots and compacts that could be discreetly tucked into a vanity drawer. These rouge came in liquid or cream form and were sometimes made with ingredients like carmine, derived from crushed cochineal insects. Yes, the blush of Edwardian high society often came courtesy of squashed beetles. Few women discussed this detail aloud at tea, but many cheerfully dabbed it on regardless, preferring insect artistry to the horror of pallid cheeks. Of course, not all rouge were created equal. Some had formulas so unstable they slid down your face after an hour, leaving you with what could best be described as drunken harlequin chic. Others contained dyes that irritated the skin, producing blotches rather than delicate roses. And because product labeling wasn't exactly rigorous, many women bought rouge without the faintest idea of what was actually in it. One day your cheeks glowed with youthful vitality. The next they broke out in a rash that suggested you'd been sunburned while juggling nettles. Despite the risks, the allure of rosy cheeks was irresistible, and part of the fascination lay in the cultural meanings attached to them. Blush symbolized youth, fertility, and passion. A rosy cheek hinted at vitality, romance, even a touch of mischief. In a world where women were expected to embody both innocence and allure, rouge was the perfect tool. It allowed a woman to look demure while secretly advertising that she was very much alive. In fact, the duality of rouge, innocent bloom versus seductive flush, made it one of the most powerful cosmetics in the Edwardian arsenal. And let's not forget the theatricality. Actresses and performers had long embraced rouge, their stage lights demanding exaggerated features to project vitality across the stalls. By the Edwardian era, these performers influenced mainstream fashion, pulling rouge out of the shadows and into the boudoirs of respectable women. What was once condemned as indecent became a little daring, a little glamorous. To dust your cheeks was to signal that you were in step with the modern world, part of the new wave of feminine expression that refused to be confined by Victorian dreariness. Still, society retained its contradictions. Rouge was admired but also criticized if applied too boldly. A delicate tint said, "I am fashionable." A heavy hand said, "I have joined the chorus line at the music hall." Edwardian women therefore became masters of moderation, dabbing just enough to look healthy but not so much that anyone suspected the color came from a pot instead of a frosty walk. It was an elaborate charade. Everyone knew rouge was being used, but everyone agreed to pretend otherwise. The rituals surrounding rouge application reflected this balancing act. Women would often apply their blush in private, carefully blending it in front of a mirror before emerging into society with a face that supposedly owed its glow to fresh air. Husbands, brothers, and fathers who often denounced cosmetics as trickery were meant to believe the color came naturally. This created a comedy of social pretense, where rouge was both everywhere and nowhere, obvious and invisible, acknowledged and denied. In this way, the rise of rouge revealed something deeper about Edwardian society: the tension between naturalness and artifice, between public morality and private practice. It was a reminder that beauty was always at least partly an illusion, and that illusions required work, tools, and sometimes crushed insects. Yet it also showed a society inching toward modernity, ready to embrace a little color after the pallor of the past. And so the Edwardians painted their cheeks, transforming themselves from pallid lilies into radiant roses, even if those roses occasionally bled onto handkerchiefs or stained the collars of white gowns. Rouge was a risk, a rebellion, and above all, a revelation, a splash of life painted on the canvas of porcelain skin. If Edwardian rouge was the delicate whisper of rebellion, lipstick was its bold shout. Few cosmetics had a more scandalous reputation than the little stick of color designed for lips, and for good reason. For centuries, painted lips had been associated with women who lived outside the bounds of respectability: actresses, courtesans, and anyone who had the audacity to smile without shame. To respectable Victorian matrons, lipstick was a social death sentence, proof that you had strayed too far into the murky world of vice. Yet, by the Edwardian period, this humble cosmetic began a daring journey from disreputable tool to fashionable accessory. One swipe and suddenly you weren't a lady of the night, you were a lady of the season. Part of this transformation can be credited to changing social attitudes. The Edwardians were, in many ways, restless heirs of the Victorians, tired of dour morality and hungry for glamour. Theatre, early cinema, and the rise of the modern new woman all contributed to reshaping what was acceptable. While Victorians whispered about painted women with suspicion, Edwardians began to look at actresses with admiration. After all, performers like Sarah Bernhardt, Lily Elsie, and other stage luminaries didn't just dab on lip color, they flaunted it under the lights, making crimson lips a symbol of charisma, confidence, and allure. But lipstick's rise wasn't just about glamour, it was also about politics. Enter the suffragettes. These women were not only demanding the right to vote, but also reshaping public ideas of femininity. Many suffragettes deliberately wore lipstick as a symbol of defiance, a visual reminder that they weren't going to fade into the background. Painted lips became a small but powerful act of rebellion, a way of declaring, "Yes, I am here, and I will be heard." It was the Edwardian equivalent of holding a protest sign while simultaneously perfecting your pout. Of course, the product itself was undergoing transformation. Before the Edwardian era, lip color was messy business, often applied as a paste made of crushed carmine beetles, red ochre, or even plant extracts mixed with wax. It stained everything, from cups to collars to the occasional unfortunate gentleman's handkerchief. But innovation was in the air. In 1915, Maurice Levy introduced the metal push-up tube in America. But even in the Edwardian decade just before that, early stick forms were appearing, encased in paper tubes or wrapped in silk threads like dainty little secrets. No longer just a paste smeared on with a finger, lipstick was becoming portable, discreet, and far more fashionable. Edwardian advertising also played a crucial role in lipstick's rehabilitation. Companies cleverly rebranded their products not as paint, but as tints, balms, or enhancers. These weren't vulgar smears of color, they were delicate aids to natural beauty. A lady wasn't supposed to look like she'd plastered her mouth with scarlet paste. She was supposed to look like she'd just returned from a charming stroll in crisp morning air, lips flushed with health and vitality. Of course, the reality was less morning dew and more chemically dyed wax cylinder, but the illusion was powerful enough to sway society. The cultural shift was gradual but undeniable. Among the upper classes, lipstick was still used with discretion, its presence acknowledged but politely ignored, rather like a rich uncle with a scandalous past. In artistic and progressive circles, however, it became a badge of modernity. To wear lipstick was to align yourself with the bold, the daring, and the theatrical. For working women in shops or offices, it also offered a rare chance to bring a touch of glamour into otherwise drab days. A quick swipe in the morning mirror could transform a weary clerk into a woman with a secret spark. Still, anxieties lingered. Moralists warned that lipstick was a tool of deception, tricking men into falling for women whose natural lips might be disappointingly pale. This argument, of course, assumed men were delicate creatures unable to cope with reality, a claim that would have been funnier if it hadn't been taken so seriously at the time. Critics also feared that lipstick encouraged vanity and frivolity, but those criticisms only gave the cosmetic more allure. To wear lipstick was to flirt not just with beauty but with danger. There was also something distinctly Edwardian about lipstick's dual symbolism. It was both rebellious and respectable, depending on who wore it and how. A suffragette's red lips screamed defiance against patriarchy, while a duchess's faintly tinted mouth whispered refinement at a garden party. The same product could signal seduction, strength, or simple stylishness. It was versatile, dangerous, and above all modern. And perhaps that was the heart of lipstick's revolution. It wasn't merely about color on lips, it was about choice. By adopting lipstick, women seized a small measure of agency over how they presented themselves. They decided whether to be bold or discreet, to challenge norms or to glide just beneath them. The stick of color became a symbol of self-determination wrapped in wax and dye. By the end of the Edwardian decade, lipstick was no longer the shameful mark of immorality. It had entered the mainstream, carried discreetly in handbags, applied in private boudoirs, flaunted on stage, and even smeared rebelliously across suffragette rallies. It was a revolution in miniature, painted on with a single stroke. The Edwardians may not have known it, but they were laying the groundwork for a century of lipstick dominance. From the crimson flapper lips of the 1920s to Hollywood's golden age and beyond, the Edwardian flirtation with lip color set in motion a cultural shift that would never truly fade. What began as scandal became standard. What once whispered disgrace now shouted confidence. And all it took was a little stick of red. If Edwardian rouge and lipstick were the accents, face powder was the battlefield. No cosmetic was more hotly contested, more marketed, or more central to the Edwardian ideal of elegance. Powder was the foundation, literally, upon which every other beauty gesture rested. Smooth, pale, and refined skin was the canvas society demanded, and powder manufacturers were more than happy to promise miracles in little cardboard boxes. Every brand swore that just one dab would transform you into a porcelain goddess. The truth? Every box claimed you'd look like fine china. In reality, you looked more like a porcelain doll left in the attic, fragile, dusty, and vaguely unsettling. Powder wasn't a new invention, of course. For centuries, women had dusted their faces with flour, starch, or chalk in the quest for brightness. But the Edwardian decade saw the commercial explosion of branded powders, each with glossy packaging, clever advertising, and an arsenal of claims. Gone were the days of mixing chalk dust in your kitchen. Now powders arrived in embossed tins and decorated boxes, designed to look as elegant on the vanity table as they did on your face. The competition was fierce. Companies like Peers, Piver, and local chemists advertised powders in newspapers, magazines, and even on railway posters. Their slogans promised refinement, lasting freshness, and delicate bloom. One ad boasted that its powder could withstand the harshest weather and the most searching gaze, as though every Edwardian lady lived in constant fear of being audited by the sun. Another promised that its powder was so pure it may be eaten without harm. No word on whether it improved your complexion from the inside, though it probably made for the least appetizing afternoon tea in history. The ingredients were as varied as the promises. Rice powder was popular, lending a softer finish than harsher chalk-based formulas. Some powders used finely milled talc, others zinc oxide, and still others mixtures of starches. Unfortunately, labeling was inconsistent, and you often had no idea if your delicate complexion aid was rice powder or pulverized wall plaster. Women frequently learned the truth the hard way, when perspiration caused their carefully powdered faces to streak, leaving them looking less like ethereal beings and more like melting statues in a drizzle. Advertising wasn't shy about playing on insecurities. Powders weren't just sold as beauty aids, they were marketed as social necessities. A shiny nose could ruin a reputation. A blotchy cheek could cost you a proposal. Ads warned women of the humiliation of being caught unprepared in society, urging them to always carry a compact for touch-ups. It was, in many ways, the birth of the handbag powder case, an accessory that allowed discreet repowdering at teas, theatres, and even during carriage rides. One quick dab and you could return to the illusion of effortless perfection. Though anyone sitting too close might choke on the cloud of dust you produced, the powder wars weren't just about products, they were about class. A fine French powder, sold in delicate satin-wrapped boxes, screamed refinement. A cheap chemist's brand in a tin suggested corner-cutting. Just as with dresses or jewels, the powder you used broadcasted your place on the social ladder. Some fashionable women were even known to scatter their vanity tables with expensive imported powders they rarely used, just so visitors might catch a glimpse and assume their elegance extended to every pore. One of the more amusing aspects of the powder craze was the way it clashed with Edwardian practicality. Powder promised lasting elegance, but reality had other plans. A brisk walk in London fog could cake it into streaks. A humid ballroom could turn it into paste. Even leaning too close to a gentleman's black coat could leave him dusted like a chocolate truffle. Powder may have been advertised as invisible refinement, but it was often anything but. Entire parties were known to leave behind powder smudges on upholstery, stair rails, and even the occasional potted plant. It was beauty, yes, but beauty with a trail of evidence. Still, for all its flaws, powder remained indispensable. It gave women a sense of control in a society that constantly judged appearances. A dusted nose could mean the difference between looking polished or looking plain. It also offered a psychological boost. When you powdered your face, you weren't just altering your skin, you were stepping into the Edwardian performance of elegance. To be powdered was to be prepared, armored against both critical stares and your own insecurities. Manufacturers knew this, and kept the advertising battles going strong. Each brand tried to outdo the others with promises of superior smoothness, finer milling, longer-lasting coverage. It was an arms race in which the weapon was talc, and the battlefield was your cheeks. Some companies even courted scientific language, claiming their powders had been tested by dermatologists or approved by physicians. What physicians exactly? No one could say. Perhaps ones who also moonlighted as chimney sweeps. By the close of the Edwardian era, powder was firmly entrenched as the daily essential of respectable women. It was no longer a luxury reserved for actresses or courtesans. It was a basic requirement for anyone who wanted to participate in polite society. The wars between brands might have been comical, the results sometimes streaky, but the cultural victory was complete. Face powder had become the universal language of refinement, spoken in whispers of rice dust and clouds of talc. And so Edwardian women powdered on, convinced that each little puff of dust was one step closer to porcelain perfection. They left behind not just powdered noses but powdered furniture, powdered lovers, and powdered staircases. And while every box claimed it would make you a vision of elegance, what it really gave you was something more revealing, a snapshot of a society at war with its own vanity, armed with nothing more dangerous than a puff and a promise. If the Edwardian face was a canvas of pale powder and rosy cheeks, then the eyes were the brushstrokes that gave it life. No feature could convey more emotion, more allure, or more scandal than a well-framed pair of eyes. The Edwardians understood this instinctively, which is why eyebrows, lashes, and lids became the next great frontier in the cosmetic craze. Tweezing, kohl, mascara. Suddenly the area around the eyes was less about blinking and more about performing. After all, what good was a powdered nose and rouged cheek if your gaze looked as tired as last week's wilted roses? The ideal Edwardian eye was not wild or heavily rimmed in color. This was no smoky nightclub look that would come later, with the flappers of the 1920s. The Edwardian eye was supposed to be soft, expressive, framed with definition but not smudged with excess. Think of the wide-eyed Gibson girl, her brows neatly arched, her lashes fluttering with deceptive innocence, her gaze equal parts dreamy and calculating. But creating that look required more than genetics. It required tools, jars, and occasionally the bravery to smear coal dust near your eyeballs. Tweezing was one of the first steps. Though the bold, pencil-thin brows of later decades were not yet in vogue, Edwardian women still aimed for neatness. Stray hairs were plucked with small steel or silver tweezers, sometimes heated briefly in a flame to sterilize them. Translation: to give the pain an extra kick. A well-shaped brow was seen as essential for framing the face, giving it elegance and balance. Women who went too far risked ending up with brows that looked permanently surprised, but the goal was always controlled refinement, arched enough to suggest delicacy, never so bold as to hint at unruliness. Once brows were tamed, the real drama came with kohl. Imported from the Middle East and India, kohl had been used for centuries as both a cosmetic and a supposed health aid. Edwardians embraced it primarily for its aesthetic, a dark line smudged along the lash line to make the eyes appear larger, deeper, more mysterious. Applied with tiny sticks or brushes, kohl was messy, prone to smudging, and occasionally caused irritation. Yet its effect was undeniable. With one stroke, a pair of pale, tired eyes could be transformed into soulful orbs that seemed to speak volumes. Kohl gave the Edwardian woman not just beauty, but mystery, and mystery was an invaluable currency in the drawing rooms of London. Mascara, however, was the wild card. Early versions were not the neat tubes we know today, but messy concoctions, often made at home or purchased from small chemists. A popular mixture involved petroleum jelly combined with lamp black or coal dust. The jelly provided stickiness, the soot provided color. Women applied it with small brushes, combs, or sometimes their fingers, coaxing their lashes into darker, fuller shapes. If your eyes watered from the fumes, congrats, you just invented waterproof mascara. The hazards were obvious. Soot near the eyes was never a recipe for comfort, and women often complained of stinging, watering, or clumping. Yet the allure of longer, darker lashes was too strong to resist. The fashion for bedroom eyes wasn't about heavy makeup. It was about lashes that cast a subtle shadow, eyes that glistened under gaslight, and brows that lent structure to otherwise delicate features. To neglect the eyes was to leave your performance incomplete. Theatre and early cinema played no small role in this fascination. Actresses understood that eyes were the windows to applause. Stage lighting demanded heavy emphasis around the eyes, which meant bolder use of kohl and darkened lashes. Audiences admired the effect, and soon society women began to imitate it in subtler ways. A touch of kohl, a hint of mascara, enough to suggest drama without inviting gossip. If rouge had tiptoed back into respectability, eye cosmetics were following a similar path, balancing on the line between scandalous excess and fashionable daring. The cultural symbolism of eye makeup also mattered. To darken one's eyes was to invite attention, to suggest intensity, sensuality, even danger. Pale lips could be ignored, but eyes demanded engagement. A well-lined gaze could linger across a ballroom or silence a suitor at dinner. In an era when women's voices were often dismissed, their eyes became a powerful tool of communication, and cosmetics amplified that power. Still, discretion was key. A little smudge of kohl whispered allure, too much screamed music hall performer. Society remained ambivalent about women who wore obvious eye makeup. Was she fashionable? Or was she fast? Was she avant-garde? Or was she improper? Navigating this tension required careful calibration. Many Edwardian women became experts in applying just enough definition to enhance their gaze, while insisting, of course, that they had never touched a speck of coal in their lives. And what of the gentleman? Many Edwardian men denounced cosmetics as deception, yet few seemed to complain when their fiancées or mistresses batted long, dark lashes at them. Hypocrisy aside, the power of the eye could not be denied. For women restricted in so many other areas of life, this tiny act of self-presentation, painting the frame around the windows to the soul, was both defiance and delight. By the end of the decade, the eyes had claimed their place in the beauty arsenal. Tweezers, kohl pots, mascara mixtures, each was part of the Edwardian ritual of self-construction. The dangers of coal dust and soot were real, but so too was the transformative effect of a carefully darkened lash line. In the powder wars, cheeks and noses had claimed victory. Now the eyes demanded their share of the stage, and Edwardian women, ever resourceful, were more than willing to oblige. If the Edwardian face was a carefully painted masterpiece, the hair was the frame, except this frame was less about neat borders and more about defying gravity. Edwardian women's hair wasn't simply styled, it was engineered. This was the era of the Gibson girl, that towering ideal of feminine beauty, whose hair seemed less like a natural feature and more like a structural challenge. It wasn't just a hairstyle, it was an architectural achievement with a risk of collapse. The Gibson girl coiffure was designed to look natural, but of course nothing about it was natural. Thick waves, voluminous pompadours, and elegant buns required a combination of patience, tools, and enough pomade to make a candle jealous. The style wasn't meant to be neat, it was meant to be grand. A properly arranged Gibson head suggested not just fashion sense but wealth, status, and the ability to hire a maid who could wrestle your hair into submission. The foundation of these styles was often padding. Women used rats, not the squeaking kind, but little cushions of fabric or even rolls made of their own discarded hair, saved from brushes and combs. These hair pads added volume, creating the illusion of thick, abundant locks, even if you were naturally cursed with limp strands. A Gibson girl without padding was like a cathedral without buttresses, doomed to collapse before vespers. Ladies would carefully roll and pin their hair over these supports, sculpting waves that swelled like ocean tides above their foreheads. Pomade and hair oils were essential to the process. These greasy concoctions, often scented with violet or rose, gave hair both sheen and pliability. Without them, strands would frizz or rebel against the shaping process. With them, hair became clay in the hands of the stylist. Unfortunately, pomade also meant that every pillowcase in Edwardian England lived in fear, and windy afternoons could transform a coiffure into something resembling an oil slick with feathers. But sacrifices were expected. This was art, after all. Hairpins, too, were vital. Not the discreet little clips we know today, but long, sturdy instruments capable of holding pounds of hair in place. A well-stocked boudoir might contain dozens, sometimes hundreds of pins, each driven into place with the precision of a blacksmith. There were even jokes about the deadly hairpin as a woman's weapon, though any man who'd leaned too close during the construction of a pompadour might have already considered this less a joke and more a lived experience. Elaborate styles required time, and time required help. Most wealthy Edwardian women did not tackle their hair alone. They had ladies' maids whose job was part hairdresser, part magician, part acrobat. These women twisted, rolled, padded, and pinned until their mistress looked like a walking advertisement for Charles Dana Gibson's illustrations. For those without staff, the process could still be done at home, though it often meant hours in front of a mirror, arms aching, spirits sagging, and tempers tested. If the final bun tilted slightly off-center, well, that's what hats were for. Speaking of hats, they were not an optional accessory. Edwardian hats were enormous creations, wide-brimmed, feathered, beribboned, and they needed equally impressive hair beneath them to look proportionate. A limp bun would be swallowed by a hat the size of a tea tray. A towering pompadour, however, gave balance and presence. In this sense, hair was not just personal style, it was architectural scaffolding for the millinery marvel perched on top. Without the hair, the hat looked ridiculous. With the hair, it looked like fashion. But the drama didn't end at style. Hair also carried deep symbolic meaning. Long, abundant locks had long been associated with femininity and vitality. But in the Edwardian period, how you styled that hair signaled your identity. The Gibson girl coiffure suggested independence, athleticism, and modernity. An image of a woman who could ride a bicycle, read a newspaper, and still look devastatingly elegant. Meanwhile, older or more conservative women might favor lower, sleeker buns, which hinted at restraint and tradition. Hair was not just personal, it was political. Of course, the maintenance was endless. Washing hair was a weekly ordeal at best, involving soap, water, and sometimes beer or egg rinses to give extra shine. Between washes, women relied heavily on powders to absorb oil and perfumes to mask odors. Imagine the cocktail of pomade, hair powder, and violet water wafting through Edwardian ballrooms. If the room smelled faintly like a bakery collided with a flower shop, you knew you were in the right place. Not every woman embraced the trend. Some complained that the towering pompadours looked unnatural, even clownish. Satirical magazines delighted in caricaturing women whose heads appeared to double in size thanks to hair padding. Critics argued that the style was impractical, that it consumed too much time and product. And yet, like most trends, it endured precisely because it was impractical. If you had the luxury to spend 2 hours sculpting your hair, you were signaling that you had no pressing work to do, a badge of class worn proudly on your head. There was also a more mischievous side. Young women, eager to impress or rebel, sometimes exaggerated their hairstyles to absurd heights. Stories circulated of pompadours so large they brushed against carriage roofs, or of buns so wide they knocked into door frames. Were these exaggerations? Likely, but exaggerations have a funny way of capturing the truth. Edwardian hair really was that much of a production. And so, the Edwardian woman stepped out into the world with her crown of carefully arranged waves, held together with pins, pomade, and sheer determination. She might spend her evening dazzling suitors, entertaining guests, or simply enduring the weight of it all with quiet grace. Her hair was more than style, it was spectacle, a performance perched atop her head, daring the world to look away. If powdered cheeks and towering hair made the Edwardian woman look like an artwork, perfume made her unforgettable. Scent was the invisible accessory, the finishing touch that could precede you into a room and linger long after you'd gone. In an age obsessed with appearances, fragrance became tied not just to beauty but to identity itself. A woman's perfume wasn't merely decoration, it was her calling card. If people smelled you before they saw you, congratulations, you were fashionable. Perfume in the Edwardian era was more than an indulgence, it was a marker of class. Expensive French perfumes, often imported in delicate glass flacons, were the height of refinement. Names like Houbigant, Guerlain, and Piver dominated the shelves of luxury shops in London and Paris, promising elegance in every drop. To own such a bottle was to advertise taste, wealth, and an awareness of continental trends. These fragrances often used complex blends, jasmine, rose, sandalwood, violet, layered so artfully that one whiff conjured sophistication. By contrast, cheaper perfumes were a very different story. Mass-produced scents sold at chemist shops promised floral bliss, but often delivered olfactory assault. Rosewater that smelled like it had been squeezed from yesterday's bouquet, lavender with the subtlety of a carpet cleaner, and synthetic violets so sharp they could peel paint. They were affordable, yes, but a little too enthusiastic. Wearing them was like shouting, "I am elegant," while accidentally knocking over a vase. The Edwardian fascination with scent was fueled by advances in chemistry. Synthetic fragrance compounds, such as vanillin, which gave that sweet, comforting vanilla note, allowed perfumers to create bolder, longer-lasting scents than ever before. Suddenly, a perfume didn't fade after an hour, it lingered, sometimes stubbornly so. This was both a blessing and a curse. A fine scent that clung to your gloves or parasol was enchanting. A cheap one that clung to everything you owned was less enchanting, especially when it followed you into church pews like a floral ghost. Application was itself a ritual. Perfume was dabbed delicately at pulse points, behind the ears, at the wrists, even at the crook of the elbow. Some women spritzed their handkerchiefs, ensuring that every polite dab at the nose released a fragrant cloud. Gloves, too, were occasionally perfumed, creating an aura of refinement when a lady extended her hand. It was less about overwhelming others and more about crafting a personal aura, though, as with powder and rouge, moderation was the key. Too much perfume risked placing you firmly in the category of trying too hard. Yet for all its elegance, perfume carried moral baggage. Much like makeup, fragrance had long been associated with women of dubious respectability. In Victorian times, to smell strongly of perfume was to invite suspicion. Respectable women were expected to smell of soap, linen, and nothing much else. But the Edwardian decade saw a shift. Scent became fashionable, even necessary, provided it was subtle and refined. As with rouge, the trick was to make it seem natural, like the fragrance floated from your being rather than your bottle. Perfume also held a kind of intimacy. Unlike hats or gowns, scent couldn't be seen, it could only be experienced by those near enough to catch it, which gave it a quiet sensuality. A woman might pass unnoticed visually, but leave behind an invisible trail of allure. For men, perfume could be equally striking, though not as common. Colognes and aftershaves offered gentlemen their own scented signatures. However, the Edwardians preferred their men understated in fragrance, clean, restrained, with a whiff of citrus or spice, rather than walking bouquets. Of course, perfume wasn't confined to bodies alone. The Edwardians also fragranced their homes, their clothing, even their stationery. Sachets of lavender or violet were tucked into drawers, and letters sometimes carried the faint scent of a sender's favorite perfume. A calling card that smelled of roses was more than paper. It was an extension of one's identity. In a society where appearances meant everything, scent became another layer of performance, and scent could tell stories. A rose perfume might suggest innocence and romance, while a musky blend hinted at daring. Violet was particularly fashionable, associated with modern femininity and youth. Some scents were light enough for afternoon teas, others reserved for evening balls. Choosing a perfume was not just about smelling nice, it was about communicating who you were, or at least who you wanted to be. Perfume, in this sense, was narrative in liquid form. Naturally, critics remained. Some moralists sniffed. Literally, that perfume was a mask, a deceit, a frivolous indulgence. They argued that a woman should be admired for her character, not her aroma. But such voices were drowned out in a cloud of jasmine and violet. For the Edwardians, scent had become a weapon of charm, a mark of style, and an essential part of the beauty arsenal. And so Edwardian women carried their perfumes as carefully as they carried their parasols, aware that the right fragrance could elevate them above the crowd, while the wrong one might reduce them to a cautionary tale. Perfume was art, chemistry and theatre all at once. With every dab, every scented glove, every perfumed letter, they crafted not just how they looked, but how they lingered in memory. When most people imagine Edwardian beauty, they picture pale cheeks, towering pompadours, and delicate scents floating through a ballroom. But beauty didn't stop at the face or hair, it extended right down to the fingertips. By the early 1900s, nails had become another stage on which women performed elegance. If the eyes were windows to the soul, then the nails were billboards of refinement. And suddenly, having well-kept fashionable nails wasn't just an indulgence, it was a necessity. The Edwardian nail craze didn't come out of nowhere. Advances in chemistry and grooming tools collided with a society increasingly obsessed with details. Women who had already invested time powdering, rouging, and scenting themselves now turned their gaze downward. Hands were in constant view, whether holding teacups, writing letters, or accepting dance invitations, and so they had to be immaculate. To show up at a luncheon with ragged cuticles was as embarrassing as turning up with unpowdered cheeks. Nails became yet another canvas for social competition. But here's where Edwardian restraint still reigned. Nails weren't painted in the bold reds and dramatic colors we might associate with later decades. No one in 1905 was strutting into the parlor with glossy scarlet talons. Instead, nails were polished and tinted, designed to look subtly healthy rather than conspicuously decorated. The famous half-moon manicure style emerged during this period. Nails were buffed and shaped into smooth ovals, with a pale crescent near the cuticle left bare, while the rest carried a faint tint. Your nails weren't painted, they were just politely tinted, like shy rainbows peeking from the ends of your fingers. Manicure sets became the ultimate gift for fashionable women. These weren't plastic clippers tossed in a drugstore pouch. They were elegant, velvet-lined cases containing ivory-handled files, delicate scissors, pumice sticks, and buffers made of chamois leather. Some were so ornate they looked more like jewelry boxes than grooming kits. To receive one was both a compliment and a responsibility. Your friends expected you to use it. After all, a fine set of tools wasted on chipped nails was almost criminal in Edwardian society. The ritual of the manicure became part of the weekly routine, especially for the middle and upper classes. A proper manicure involved soaking the hands in warm water, pushing back the cuticles with tools that often looked alarmingly sharp, and filing the nails into elegant shapes. Then came buffing with powders and creams until the nails shone with a soft, pearl-like gleam. For women with money, visiting a professional manicurist was an option, and salons began to offer dedicated nail services. For others, the home kit sufficed, often with the help of a maid armed with a buffer and more patience than sense. One of the most interesting elements of Edwardian nail culture was how closely it tied into broader ideas of hygiene and modernity. The Victorians had equated beauty with morality, but the Edwardians increasingly linked it with health. Smooth, neat nails suggested cleanliness, sophistication, and attention to detail. Ragged nails hinted at laziness, sloppiness, or worse, manual labor. Manicured hands whispered, "I am delicate enough to spend an afternoon fussing over cuticles instead of hauling coal." Color, when it appeared at all, was faint and natural. Early nail polishes were less like paint and more like tinted varnishes or pastes. Recipes circulated in magazines promising pinkish tones using ingredients like carmine and oils. Buffing creams often left behind a faint sheen that hinted at polish without the obviousness of lacquer. In this way, Edwardian nails walked the fine line between enhancement and deception. They had to look effortlessly lovely, even though effort was as usual the entire point. Not everyone applauded the trend. Critics sniffed that spending time on nails was frivolous, another example of women's supposed vanity. But that only made nail care more appealing. In a society where women were denied many forms of expression, even a sliver of pink sheen on a fingertip could feel like a statement. It was small rebellion disguised as polish. If rouge on cheeks risked raising eyebrows, nails flew under the radar, allowing women to experiment with a degree of freedom. Men noticed too, even if they pretended not to. A delicately manicured hand extending a glove, holding a cigarette, or placing a bid at an auction carried an aura of sophistication. Glossy nails could turn something as mundane as pouring tea into an act of theatre. The hand became part of the Edwardian performance, every gesture a chance to display refinement. Of course, reality intruded as it always did. Manicure creams often contained questionable ingredients, some so oily they left fingerprints on every surface. Buffers wore down quickly, leading to uneven results, and cheap nail pastes sometimes left stains that took weeks to fade. Still, women persevered. The pursuit of elegance always outweighed the risk of smudged letters or greasy teacups. By the end of the Edwardian decade, manicures had secured their place in the beauty routine. While still modest compared to later styles, they marked a turning point. Beauty was no longer confined to the face. Every detail of the body could be polished, perfected, and presented to society. The Edwardian woman was a living work of art, and her nails were the delicate brushstrokes that completed the picture. If Edwardian women were learning the art of powdering, painting, and perfuming, much of their inspiration came not from royalty or aristocracy, but from the stage, Actresses in the early 1900s were the beauty influencers of their day. Long before sponsored posts and ring lights, there were posters, postcards, and gossip columns spreading their image across Britain. The theatre was a mirror and a megaphone, magnifying fashion trends and sending them trickling down into society. Theatre stars proved makeup didn't just belong on stage, it belonged in your mother's disapproving frown too. Theatre had always walked a precarious line in respectability. For centuries, actresses were considered morally suspect, lumped unfairly with courtesans simply because they wore makeup and performed for male audiences. But the Edwardian era began to soften that stigma. Stars like Lily Elsie, Ellen Terry, and Gabrielle Ray became cultural icons admired not just for their performances but for their beauty. Their portraits appeared on cigarette cards, postcards and posters, bringing their painted faces into the drawing rooms of respectable households. Suddenly, the very look once condemned as vulgar was being imitated by society's daughters. Stage makeup was of course more dramatic than anything worn off stage. Gaslight and later, early electric lighting demanded stronger pigments to keep features visible from the back of a theatre. Actresses layered on rice powder, carmine rouge, and darkened brows so their expressions wouldn't vanish into the shadows. What looked exaggerated in the dressing room became luminous under the glare of the stage. The audience wasn't just watching a play, they were watching a beauty lesson. Women noticed how rouge could enliven pale cheeks, how darker lashes made eyes smolder, how even lips looked more expressive when tinted. They carried those observations home, experimenting with subtler versions in their own mirrors. The celebrity culture surrounding these actresses amplified the effect. Newspapers and magazines covered their performances, but also their private lives, their wardrobes and their beauty routines. Readers devoured every detail, eager to know which creams or powders a star favored. Some actresses even lent their names to beauty products, turning their stage fame into commercial power. Buying a jar of Lily Elsie's cold cream or Gabrielle Ray's complexion powder was more than a cosmetic choice, it was an attempt to borrow a fragment of glamour. Of course, not everyone approved. The older generation muttered about painted women, corrupting society's morals. Mothers scolded daughters for daring to imitate actresses' styles, warning that rouge and lipstick would lead them down the slippery slope toward ruin, or worse, jazz music. Yet scolding rarely worked. The allure of celebrity was stronger than parental disapproval. After all, who would you rather emulate? Your mother, who smelled faintly of starch, or Gabrielle Ray, who could set hearts racing with a single flutter of her powdered lashes? Interestingly, the actresses themselves walked a delicate tightrope. To succeed, they needed the glamour and the makeup to be admired beyond the theatre, they needed to appear respectable. Many cultivated public images of refinement, emphasizing modesty and grace even as they relied on layers of cosmetics for their onstage allure. This balancing act mirrored the larger shift in society. Makeup was becoming fashionable, but only if applied with the illusion of naturalness. Theatre also provided practical lessons in technique. Stage makeup artists, often the actresses themselves, since professional makeup artists were rare, developed tricks that filtered into broader use. The idea of contouring, for example, has its distant roots here, using shadow and highlight to sculpt the face for the audience. The Edwardians didn't call it contouring, of course, but they understood that a dab of darker powder under the cheekbone, or a line of kohl at the lash, could transform how features appeared. Offstage, women began to experiment with toned-down versions, applying the lessons of the stage in their drawing rooms. Postcards played an enormous role in spreading these styles. The Edwardian era was postcard mad, and glossy images of actresses in their finery were exchanged, collected, and pinned to mirrors. These cards functioned much like modern Instagram posts, offering idealized snapshots of beauty to be admired and imitated. One didn't need to attend the theatre to absorb its influence. You only needed to glance at the postcard rack outside a tobacconist. For working-class women, actresses represented both aspiration and accessibility. Unlike aristocratic ladies whose beauty seemed unattainable, actresses were self-made stars, women who had risen through talent and charm. Their use of makeup seemed less scandalous and more empowering, a reminder that beauty could be crafted, not simply inherited. For middle-class women, imitating an actress's style was daring but thrilling, a way to flirt with modernity while still claiming innocence. The influence of actresses also helped normalize the idea of cosmetics as tools rather than tricks. If a celebrated star could wear rouge and still be admired, why couldn't you? If kohl on stage enhanced beauty, maybe a little kohl at home could do the same. Slowly, the line between performance and daily life blurred, and cosmetics crossed it with powdery footprints. By the close of the Edwardian decade, the theatre had succeeded where pamphlets and sermons had failed. It had made cosmetics fashionable. Actresses were no longer just entertainers. They were trendsetters, cultural arbiters, beauty tutors for a society inching toward modernity. The stage didn't just teach women how to apply makeup. It taught them that it was acceptable, even desirable to do so. And so, as Edwardian audiences applauded their favorite stars, they were also applauding the very tools that would shape 20th century beauty culture. Every gasp at a powdered cheek or crimson lip was another nail in the coffin of Victorian restraint. The theatre had turned makeup from sin to spectacle, and in the process made every Edwardian boudoir a little bit more of a stage. The Edwardian suffragettes weren't just fighting for the vote. They were also rewriting the rules of how women could look. In a world where powder, rouge and lipstick were still considered daring or even morally suspect, some suffragettes seized cosmetics as part of their rebellion. Beauty, they argued, wasn't just frivolity, it was power. Votes for women, and lipstick shades for everyone. It may seem odd to connect painted lips with political protests, but for the suffragettes, appearances mattered just as much as speeches and banners. Their marches, meetings and rallies were scrutinized by newspapers and politicians eager to dismiss them as unfeminine, hysterical, or unattractive. The stereotype of the suffragette as a dowdy, hatchet-faced spinster was deliberately cultivated by critics to undermine their cause. But many women countered that image with calculated glamour. Rouge, powder, and especially lipstick became tools to say, we are modern, we are visible, and we are not going to fade quietly into the background. The lipstick in particular was revolutionary. For centuries it had been taboo, associated with actresses or sex workers, but suffragettes reclaimed it as a badge of defiance. Marching with red lips was both shocking and thrilling. It caught attention, unsettled critics, and gave the movement a modern, daring image. Instead of shrinking from accusations of vanity, some suffragettes leaned into it, declaring that beauty and political agency were not opposites. Why couldn't a woman demand the vote while wearing carmine? Why shouldn't equality look stylish? New York suffragists were especially bold. In 1912, during a large parade, many women deliberately wore red lipstick as a coordinated statement. It wasn't just decoration, it was symbolism. Painted lips became the visual equivalent of a banner, loud, defiant, impossible to ignore. In Britain, the approach was more mixed. Some women in the movement still frowned on makeup as frivolous, preferring sober dress and plain faces to convey seriousness. Yet even there, the presence of fashionable suffragettes in their sashes and carefully painted cheeks sent a message: you could be both glamorous and political. The clash of opinions within the movement was telling. For traditionalists, cosmetics were a distraction, undermining the moral seriousness of the cause. They worried that a woman in rouge and lipstick would confirm stereotypes rather than dismantle them. For radicals, however, makeup was a weapon. If society already judged women based on appearance, why not take control of that judgment and wield it strategically? A suffragette in lipstick wasn't just a protester, she was a billboard. Her very face contradicted the claim that women were too meek or too plain for public life. There was also an element of performance. Suffragette rallies were highly visual events, banners waving, sashes gleaming in purple, white and green. Adding a splash of rouge or a swipe of lipstick made the women more striking, more photogenic, and more memorable. In an age when newspapers were filled with caricatures mocking the movement, suffragettes understood the value of crafting their own image. Beauty, in this context, wasn't vanity, it was politics. Not every woman wore makeup to the marches. But even the debate surrounding it was transformative. For the first time, cosmetics were openly tied to ideas of identity and empowerment. Wearing rouge could mean more than looking healthy. It could mean announcing allegiance to a cause. Lipstick was no longer just pigment on lips. It was defiance painted in red. And let's not forget the practical side. Protests were grueling affairs, lasting hours in the sun or rain, and fatigue was inevitable. A dab of powder or rouge could help a suffragette look less weary, masking exhaustion so critics couldn't accuse her of weakness. It was a kind of war paint, not in the sense of deception, but in the sense of resilience. You painted your face to show that you were ready to fight. The critics, of course, scoffed. Newspapers delighted in describing painted suffragettes with a mixture of ridicule and moral alarm. But in doing so, they only proved the point. The cosmetics had been noticed, and the message had landed. By forcing society to confront painted women in public, suffragettes broke down the old assumption that makeup belonged only in theatres or boudoirs. Cosmetics had entered the political arena, and they weren't leaving. This blending of beauty and politics had long-term consequences. It cracked open the door for cosmetics to be seen as modern, bold, and even progressive. By the 1920s, when lipstick became the badge of the flapper, the groundwork had been laid by suffragettes who marched before them, faces bright with both determination and rouge. What began as scandal in the Edwardian decade became a standard of modern femininity. So while the suffragettes are rightly remembered for chaining themselves to railings, going on hunger strikes and demanding the vote, we shouldn't overlook the quieter revolution happening in their cosmetic choices. Each powdered cheek and painted lip was a statement of ownership over their own image. It said, "We are here, and we will be seen on our terms." The Edwardians had no shortage of ambition when it came to beauty, but unfortunately, they also had no shortage of poison. In an era when scientific progress dazzled society with new inventions, it was easy to assume that anything bottled, boxed, or advertised in a glossy magazine was safe. Spoiler, it wasn't. For all the elegance of vanity tables and the glamour of rouge pots, Edwardian cosmetics often came with a lethal twist: lead, mercury, arsenic. Beauty's deadliest love triangle were common ingredients, lurking behind the promises of youth and refinement. Nothing says timeless beauty like glowing in the dark from lead powder. Take lead, the silent assassin of the cosmetic world. It was often used in face powders and creams for its whitening effect. A dusting of lead-based powder could instantly banish redness, freckles, and any trace of sun, leaving behind the ghostly pallor so beloved by Edwardian society. But the price of porcelain skin was steep. It absorbed into the skin over time, causing everything from muscle weakness to neurological issues. Women who swore by these powders sometimes noticed their hair falling out or their skin erupting into sores, a tragic irony for those who had set out only to look flawless. If your powder compact made you look radiant today, it might also make you collapse tomorrow. Mercury, meanwhile, was the enthusiastic accomplice. Mercury salts appeared in freckle creams and skin lighteners, touted as miracle workers for blotchy complexions. Advertisements promised to erase blemishes, as if mercury were a magic eraser for the face. In reality, mercury damaged the kidneys and nervous system, causing trembling hands, irritability, and sometimes madness. One wonders how many Edwardian ladies, after dabbing on their blemish banisher, ended up shaky not from scandal but from mercury poisoning. Yet society accepted these risks because the results were immediate. Clearer skin today was worth a foggy mind tomorrow. And then there was arsenic, the crown jewel of dangerous beauty. Some women ingested arsenic wafers sold as complexion tablets, designed to produce that pale, luminous glow so admired in drawing rooms. Arsenic's trick was to dilate the capillaries, giving the skin a temporary brightness. The problem, of course, was that arsenic also happened to be a poison. Over time, it caused vomiting, hair loss, and internal damage. Imagine slipping a little poison with your morning tea, not because you hated your neighbor, but because you wanted to look fresh for a garden party. It was beauty by slow suicide, and still, women bought the wafers in alarming numbers. Even the less exotic ingredients could be hazardous. Bismuth powder gave a pearly sheen, but often caused skin irritation that looked suspiciously like the spots it was meant to conceal. Some rouge contained carmine mixed with harsh chemicals that blistered sensitive skin. Hair dyes used metallic salts that gradually turned strands green or black in unpredictable ways, sometimes burning the scalp in the process. And mascaras made with petroleum and soot posed the constant risk of eye infections, ensuring that your dramatic gaze came at the cost of itchy, inflamed eyelids. The lack of regulation only made matters worse. Cosmetics were not subject to the strict testing or safety laws we take for granted today. Manufacturers could market a cream as gentle or pure without disclosing that it contained enough heavy metals to build a small bridge. Labels were vague, sometimes deliberately misleading. A complexion tonic might sound wholesome, but behind the flowery wording lay concoctions better suited to an alchemist's cauldron than a lady's dressing table. Why then did women continue to use these products? Part of the answer lies in the power of advertising. Edwardian marketing was a masterclass in persuasion, offering visions of eternal youth and social success. To be flawless was to be admired, and admiration was worth any cost. Another factor was ignorance. Many users simply didn't know how dangerous the ingredients were. Science had advanced enough to create new chemicals, but not enough to make safety a priority. And finally, there was the eternal human gamble, the belief that bad outcomes happen to other people, never to oneself. There was also an addictive quality to these cosmetics. Arsenic wafers, for instance, could create a short-lived glow that made the user feel instantly improved. That temporary success made it easy to overlook the long-term consequences. Much like fad diets or miracle supplements today, Edwardian beauty products offered quick fixes that were hard to resist, even if they came with whispers of danger. Some critics did sound alarms. Medical journals occasionally published warnings about the hazards of lead and mercury, and moralists condemned the use of such unnatural enhancements. But these warnings rarely reached the women who needed them most. Glossy advertisements drowned out caution with promises of elegance, youth, and love. If the choice was between being pale and admired now, or healthy but overlooked, many chose the powder puff over prudence. The result was a strange paradox. Cosmetics meant to enhance beauty often destroyed it. Women striving for delicate complexions ended up with rashes, bald patches, or worse. Yet the cultural pressure to appear flawless was so strong that even these risks didn't stop the market from thriving. The poisoned face was, in many ways, a symbol of the Edwardian age itself, gorgeous on the surface, unstable underneath. And so Edwardian women powdered, painted and perfumed, blissfully unaware, or perhaps willfully ignoring that their beauty arsenal doubled as a chemical arsenal. They pursued elegance with the determination of soldiers, fighting a quiet war against freckles, wrinkles, and social judgment, armed with toxins masquerading as glamour. For some, the price of beauty was not just money or time, but health itself. For every Edwardian lady smearing arsenic wafers across her lips or dusting her cheeks with lead-based powder, there was another rummaging through her kitchen in search of beauty miracles. If commercial cosmetics carried risks, and oh they did, homemade remedies offered a tempting alternative. Why trust the chemist's mysterious jar when you could whip up a cure from yesterday's breakfast? Thus, the Edwardian boudoir often smelled less like a perfumery and more like a farmer's market gone rogue. DIY beauty was alive and well, and it was as strange as it was resourceful. Your face wasn't glowing, it was just omelette adjacent. Eggs, for example, were a cornerstone of Edwardian home beauty. Women cracked them not just for cakes and custards, but for skincare. Egg whites were beaten and applied as masks to tighten the complexion. Once dry, the face felt taut, a temporary illusion of youth and firmness. Of course, it also made it difficult to move your mouth without cracking like plaster. Imagine trying to maintain an air of refined dignity while your face resembled a meringue drying in the oven. Still, women swore by it, praising egg whites as a cheap and natural facelift. The yolks, meanwhile, were sometimes mixed with oils to create nourishing hair treatments, making your head smell faintly of breakfast but allegedly leaving it glossy. Cucumber was another darling of Edwardian DIY. Not content with its role in sandwiches at garden parties, the humble cucumber was sliced, mashed and juiced into endless concoctions. Women pressed cool slices to their eyes to reduce puffiness, a ritual so enduring it still survives today. More elaborate recipes involved grating cucumbers and mixing them with rosewater to create whitening lotions. The goal was not hydration but pallor. A cucumber mask might promise to leave you fresh as a spring morning, but in truth, it left you smelling like a salad bar on parade. Honey also enjoyed a loyal following. Mixed with milk or oatmeal, it was daubed onto the skin as a soothing mask. Advocates claimed it softened the complexion and banished blemishes. Skeptics, meanwhile, pointed out that it left you sticky enough to attract every fly in the county. But honey carried a romantic aura, connected in the public imagination with ancient beauty practices. Cleopatra supposedly bathed in it, and if it was good enough for her, surely it could hold its own against Edwardian blemishes. Rosewater was another favorite, distilled at home by women who fancied themselves alchemists. Bottles of it sat proudly on vanity tables, ready to be splashed on faces as tonics or mixed into creams. It smelled pleasant enough, though more like perfume than actual skincare. Nevertheless, its popularity endured because it felt elegant, and it was far less likely to poison you than mercury cream. In a world teetering between chemical marvels and kitchen cures, rosewater stood out as a safe middle ground. Some recipes veered into the truly bizarre. Women rubbed raw potatoes on freckles, convinced that starch could banish spots like magic erasers. Vinegar was another popular ingredient, dabbed onto the skin in hopes of whitening complexions or used as a hair rinse for shine. The effect was less ethereal beauty, and more you smell like a pickle. But practicality often bowed to desperation. Bread poultices, almond pastes, and even mixtures of soot and butter circulated in magazines as surefire remedies for everything from wrinkles to unruly brows. Magazines and ladies' journals played a crucial role in spreading these recipes. Columns titled Hints for the Complexion or Household Beauties promised readers they could achieve refinement without spending a fortune on imported powders. The appeal was obvious. Homemade beauty was affordable, accessible, and safe, or at least safer than arsenic wafers. Whether it worked or not was another question entirely. For every woman who claimed cucumber lotion made her glow, another quietly admitted it left her skin smelling like yesterday's soup. But homemade remedies weren't just about thrift or safety. They also carried symbolic weight. To make your own beauty treatments was to exert control over your body in a society where so many choices were restricted. It was also a way of aligning with naturalness, a value still prized even as makeup gained popularity. A woman could proudly declare she used no vulgar paint while secretly whipping egg whites into her mirror mask every Tuesday. DIY beauty straddled the line between morality and vanity, allowing women to participate in beauty culture without admitting it outright. Of course, homemade remedies had their drawbacks. They were messy, time-consuming, and sometimes comically ineffective. A face mask of oatmeal and milk might nourish the skin, or it might just leave you resembling half-finished porridge. Vinegar rinses did leave hair shiny, but also left husbands politely asking why their wives smelled like a tavern floor, and the effort required was staggering. Imagine grating cucumbers daily, boiling rose petals on the stove, or carefully straining honey mixtures, all in the name of fleeting refinement. Yet Edwardian women persevered, driven by the belief that beauty demanded sacrifice, even if the sacrifice was smelling like lunch. In retrospect, the DIY craze reflects the duality of the Edwardian era itself. On one hand, women embraced modernity, buying powders and rouge from glittering shops. On the other, they clung to the idea of natural remedies, grounding their beauty in the kitchen and garden. The line between domestic labor and self-care blurred. A cucumber that went into your salad could also go onto your cheeks. Beauty wasn't confined to the boudoir. It spilled into the pantry, the garden, and the very act of cooking dinner. And so Edwardian women experimented, blending eggs, cucumbers, honey, and vinegar into endless masks and tonics. Their faces bore the evidence of trial and error, sometimes radiant, sometimes rashy, sometimes sticky enough to trap insects. But whether effective or not, these recipes gave them a sense of agency, a chance to participate in the great performance of beauty without handing over their health to the poison bottles of the commercial market. If Edwardian women had tired of cracking eggs on their faces or smearing cucumber mush into their pores, there was a new solution: step into the glittering, mysterious world of the beauty salon. By the early 1900s, professional salons were popping up in cities like London, Paris, and New York, promising miracles in jars, bottles, and steaming contraptions that looked suspiciously like torture devices. These were not the modest barbershops men frequented for a shave. No. Beauty salons were temples of transformation, where youth could supposedly be restored, skin could be remade, and refinement was just an appointment away. Step inside and they'll restore your youth. Step outside and you'll look like you lost a wrestling match with soap. The appeal was obvious. At home, beauty routines were either limited to powders and rouge, or descended into kitchen chaos with honey masks and vinegar rinses. Salons, by contrast, offered something new: science, or at least something that looked like science. Glossy advertisements depicted women reclining gracefully, while attendants hovered with steaming wands or futuristic-looking devices. Treatments were presented as cutting-edge, infused with modern medical authority, even if the results were more dubious than divine. Inside these salons, wealthy clients encountered an array of treatments that ranged from the familiar to the bizarre. Steam baths were a staple. Women sat with their faces enveloped in hot vapors to open the pores, a process that left them red-faced but reassured that impurities had been purged. Facial massages were another favorite, supposedly improving circulation and smoothing wrinkles. Salons also offered skin tonics, applied by skilled attendants, which often contained the same dubious ingredients as shop-bought cosmetics, but with the added flourish of professional hands. Somehow, being poisoned felt more respectable if someone in a crisp white uniform did it for you. But salons didn't stop at creams and massages. They embraced the weird and the wonderful. One popular device resembled a metal contraption placed over the face, buzzing with mild electrical currents that promised to stimulate the skin. Clients swore by the tingling, convinced they were gaining youth with every jolt. In reality, they were just paying good money to be lightly electrocuted. Other salons promoted vacuum suction machines designed to suck out impurities, often leaving their victims with alarming purple bruises that looked less like beauty treatments and more like brawls. Hair treatments also featured prominently. Salons offered scalp massages, pomades, and even early versions of chemical hair straightening or curling. Heated irons shaped hair into waves, though the risk of burns was ever present. One wrong move, and your elegant coiffure became a smoking reminder of salon hazards. Still, the allure of professional care was irresistible. A maid at home might manage your pompadour, but she couldn't promise scientifically proven methods for rejuvenating your scalp. Salons weren't just about the treatments themselves, they were about the experience. Entering a salon meant stepping into an exclusive world of pampering, sophistication, and gossip. Wealthy women gathered not only to improve their looks, but also to socialize. In plush waiting rooms, they exchanged tips, compared treatments, and whispered about which actress or duchess had been spotted indulging in a facial. The salon became as much a social hub as a place of beauty, a rare semi-public space where women could occupy center stage without the presence of men. There was also a theatrical quality to the entire process. The attendants, often dressed in pristine uniforms, performed their tasks with ritualistic flair. Towels were draped, creams applied, and machines wheeled out like stage props. A trip to the salon wasn't just about the outcome, it was about the drama of transformation. Even if you left looking like a boiled beetroot, you could still relish the fact that you had participated in a ritual of modern beauty. Naturally, critics abounded. Moralists accused salons of encouraging vanity and frivolity. Doctors occasionally warned against the risks of electrical gadgets and harsh tonics. Husbands grumbled about the expense, muttering that their wives returned looking no different. except perhaps slightly more pink and significantly lighter in the pocketbook. But for many women, the salon represented freedom. It was one of the few spaces where they could indulge in themselves, spend their own money, and feel in control of their appearance. The rise of salons also marked an important shift in how beauty was understood. No longer confined to the private boudoir, beauty was becoming public and professional. It was no longer something women had to handle alone in secret. It could be openly pursued in a salon chair, under the hands of experts, amid the hum of machinery and the hiss of steam. That shift carried symbolic weight. Beauty wasn't just a domestic ritual anymore. It was a business, an industry, a profession. By the end of the Edwardian decade, beauty salons had firmly established themselves as part of the landscape of modern life. They foreshadowed the vast beauty industry that would dominate the 20th century with its spas, clinics, and endless innovations. While their treatments may seem primitive or downright alarming by modern standards, their cultural significance was enormous. They represented the fusion of science, commerce, and self-image, all wrapped in a scented towel, and so Edwardian women kept flocking to salons, emerging with red cheeks, tingling scalps, and stories to share. Some left glowing, others left blotchy, but all left convinced that they had taken part in the grand experiment of modern beauty. For better or worse, the salon had arrived, and the world of self-care would never be the same again. The Edwardian era wasn't only a laboratory for women's beauty experiments, it was also a stage for men's opinions about those experiments, opinions which they delivered freely and often without being asked. Edwardian men could debate politics at their clubs and finances at their offices, but when it came to cosmetics, they were suddenly philosophers, poets, and moral critics rolled into one. Whether makeup was moral, necessary, or scandalous became a topic of drawing room gossip, newspaper editorials, and even sermons. And yet, for all their lofty pronouncements, men were hopelessly inconsistent. Men claimed they liked a natural look, which ironically took 3 hours and 12 powders to achieve. To begin with, Edwardian men inherited Victorian suspicion toward cosmetics. Many grew up being told that painted faces belonged to actresses or fallen women. Respectable wives and daughters were meant to glow with innocence, not kohl and rouge. Some men carried this suspicion into adulthood, loudly proclaiming that cosmetics were a form of deceit, a mask that corrupted purity. In letters to newspapers, men fretted that painted women tricked unsuspecting gentlemen into marriage. The fear wasn't that the rouge would fade by midnight, but that it would fade after the honeymoon, leaving the poor man shackled to a woman whose cheeks no longer blazed like roses. Others saw cosmetics not as immoral but as unnecessary. In their view, real beauty needed no enhancement. This idea may sound flattering, but it often came wrapped in hypocrisy. The same men who praised natural beauty also gravitated toward actresses and socialites, who coincidentally never left the house without rouge, powder, and an arsenal of pins. Natural beauty, it seemed, was rarely natural at all. It was carefully constructed, then politely ignored. Still others, particularly younger and more progressive men, treated cosmetics with fascination. They admired women who followed the latest styles, seeing them as modern, sophisticated, and cosmopolitan. For these men, painted lips and powdered faces weren't scandal, they were allure. Such men might even buy beauty products as gifts, indulging their wives or mistresses with imported French powders or perfumes. Their approval was not universal, of course, but it demonstrated that attitudes toward makeup were shifting, even among the supposedly skeptical male population. There was also the double standard of male grooming itself. While men sneered at women's powders, they cheerfully waxed their mustaches, oiled their beards, and doused themselves in cologne. A gentleman could spend half an hour coaxing his whiskers into perfect curls with pomade and tongs, yet still wag a finger at his sister for tinting her nails. Vanity was acceptable for men if it came with the scent of bay rum and cigar smoke. For women, it had to be carefully disguised as health or freshness. The contradiction extended to romance as well. Men complained about paint in general but were often captivated by its results. A woman's powdered complexion, her rouged lips, her brightened eyes, they were irresistible, even to those who swore they despised cosmetics. The proof lay in the popularity of actresses, whose beauty, aided by generous applications of makeup, drew adoring male fans. Men didn't line up for postcards of pale, unpainted faces. They wanted the glamour, the allure, the sparkle that cosmetics helped create. Of course, this left women in a delicate bind. They were expected to look beautiful but not admit to trying. They were told to stay natural but also to keep pace with fashion. A woman who wore too much rouge risked being called indecent. A woman who wore none risked being called dowdy. Navigating these contradictory expectations required both skill and humor. Women learned to apply powder and rouge in private, stepping out with unpainted faces that looked miraculously perfect. Men could then congratulate themselves on loving their wives' natural beauty, blissfully unaware that it came courtesy of arsenic-free powder and 15 minutes of coal artistry. Satirical magazines of the time poked fun at this dance. Cartoons showed men recoiling in horror when their wives or sweethearts appeared without their usual enhancements. The joke, of course, was that men didn't really want natural beauty. They wanted curated beauty disguised as naturalness. The humor may have been exaggerated, but it struck a chord. Everyone knew that cosmetics were part of daily life, even if the men of the house pretended otherwise. Not all male voices were critical. Some writers openly defended cosmetics, arguing that if women gained confidence and happiness from powders and rouge, then who were men to object? These champions were rare, but they offered a refreshing counterpoint to the constant lectures. They also hinted at what was to come, a modern world where men's approval or disapproval mattered less than women's own choices. By the end of the Edwardian decade, male opinion had not settled into consensus. Some clung to the old morality, others admired cosmetics as part of modern femininity, and many remained blissfully contradictory. What mattered most, however, was that women were beginning to ignore these debates altogether. Whether men approved or not, cosmetics had already claimed their place in the boudoir, the salon, and the social imagination. And so the men could mutter about rouge and powder, shake their heads at painted lips, and write pompous editorials about morality. Meanwhile, women powdered their noses, darkened their lashes, and smiled sweetly, knowing that the men would still fall head over heels for their natural beauty. The irony was delicious. Men insisted they preferred women unadorned, even as women proved every evening at the theatre or every afternoon at tea that adornment was the very essence of allure. If there was one invention that shaped Edwardian beauty as much as powders or pomades, it was the art of advertising. By the early 1900s, cosmetics were no longer whispered about behind boudoir doors. They were shouted from posters, paraded through glossy magazines, and smuggled into daily life as essential purchases. Beauty companies had learned a powerful truth. If you wrapped a jar in promises, women would buy not just the cream inside, but the dream it carried. Buy this cream and suddenly you'll be irresistible, or at least slightly less ghostly. The Edwardian era was the golden age of printed advertising. Advances in color lithography meant posters could dazzle with vibrant reds, greens, and blues. Women walking through the streets of London were greeted by elegant illustrations of flawless faces gazing dreamily into the distance, their complexions smooth as porcelain. The message was clear. This could be you, if only you purchased the powder, cream, or tonic in question. The artistry of the ads was as important as the product itself. They didn't just sell cosmetics, they sold fantasies. Magazines, too, became battlegrounds for beauty brands. Periodicals like The Ladies' Realm and The Queen featured pages of advertisements nestled between society gossip and fashion spreads. A woman might read about the Duchess of Devonshire's garden party on one page, then turn the page to discover an ad promising that a dab of snow-white powder would give her the same aristocratic glow. The placement was intentional. Glamour was no longer limited to duchesses and actresses. It could be yours, for the modest price of a shilling and a little suspension of disbelief. The language of these ads was nothing short of poetry or comedy, depending on your perspective. Creams were youth in a jar, powders were the secret to everlasting bloom, and lotions were miracle restorers. Every blemish was an enemy, every wrinkle a battle scar, every freckle a tragedy to be vanquished. Ads didn't simply sell products, they sold insecurity, then offered the cure. If you didn't already feel worried about your complexion, an Edwardian advertisement would cheerfully inform you that you should. One particularly clever tactic was the use of pseudoscience. Words like dermatological, scientifically tested, and physician-approved popped up in ads, often without the faintest shred of evidence. Some companies even invented doctors to endorse their products, complete with impressive-sounding but entirely fictitious credentials. It was all part of the performance. Cosmetics weren't just powders and paints, they were formulas, tonics and serums, carrying the aura of modern science. After all, who wouldn't trust a cream that sounded like it belonged in a laboratory instead of a vanity table? Illustrations also played a key role. Images of women before and after using a product were common, though the before woman always looked like she'd spent the last week weeping in a coal cellar, while the after version beamed with the radiance of an angel just descended from heaven. These exaggerated transformations were irresistible, planting the idea that one small purchase could completely reinvent you. It was less about reality and more about imagination, cosmetics as fairy godmother in powder form. Advertising also reflected the class consciousness of Edwardian society. Expensive French perfumes were marketed with elegant fonts and imagery dripping in sophistication. Ladies in gowns, chandeliers, roses in crystal vases. Meanwhile, cheaper powders were pitched to the aspiring middle classes with phrases like, "Every lady may possess refinement." This was beauty as social ladder. Your jar of powder wasn't just for your complexion, it was for your reputation. Even the packaging became part of the seduction. Tins were embossed with gold lettering, boxes wrapped in satin ribbons, bottles corked and sealed like treasure. Women bought powders not just to use them but to display them. A vanity table crowded with ornate containers was itself a status symbol, a quiet signal to visitors that one was not only fashionable but well supplied in the war against freckles and dullness. Notably, these ads weren't limited to women. Men were a target audience too, though indirectly. Advertisements often implied that a woman's attractiveness and therefore her marriage prospects depended on the right cream. Retain his admiration, one lotion ad urged, while another warned that a dull complexion may cost you more than a smile can regain. It was marketing by fear and flirtation, all wrapped in elegant prose. Of course there were skeptics. Satirical magazines loved to lampoon the absurd claims of beauty products, printing cartoons of women drowning in powders or men recoiling from clouds of scent. Yet satire rarely dented the market. The ads worked because they tapped into universal desires, to be admired, to be envied, to belong. Even if women knew the promises were exaggerated, they still reached for the powders and creams because hope, however improbable, came cheap enough in a tin. By the end of the Edwardian decade, advertising had done what centuries of taboo could not. It had normalized cosmetics. What had once been sinful or scandalous was now presented as modern, scientific, and aspirational. Women no longer whispered about powders, they ordered them by mail. The beauty industry had discovered its most powerful tool, not kohl, not rouge, not even lipstick, but advertising itself. And so Edwardian women carried their jars and bottles home, not just for what they contained, but for what they promised. Each product was a story, a fantasy, a small piece of hope dressed up in satin and gold. Whether or not the powder actually made you look like a duchess mattered less than the fact that the advertisement convinced you it might. In the Edwardian world, beauty wasn't just about looking good, it was about announcing who you were, where you belonged, and more importantly, who you definitely were not. Cosmetics and grooming became a social language, one spoken differently by the aristocracy lounging in country houses and the working women sprinting between shifts. Upper-class beauty said, "I can afford not to sweat." Lower-class beauty said, "I powdered my exhaustion," and both, in their own ways, were utterly consumed by appearances. For the aristocratic woman, beauty was a performance of leisure. Her pale complexion whispered of drawing rooms and parasols, not fields or factories. Every detail of her appearance was carefully curated to project effortless refinement. Her vanity table was stacked with imported powders, creams in delicate porcelain jars, and perfumes wrapped in satin bows. She had the money to purchase the most fashionable products, and the time to spend hours each morning preparing her face, hair, and hands. If her cheeks glowed, it was from carmine rouge. If her lashes fluttered, it was because someone had patiently applied coal dust in neat lines. Her beauty was not simply personal, it was political. It said, "I am above work, above sun, above struggle." For working women, the story was different. Factory girls, shop assistants, seamstresses and servants didn't have the luxury of sprawling vanity tables or imported French perfumes. Their cosmetics, if they had them at all, were modest. A tin of inexpensive powder, a dab of homemade lotion, perhaps a shared pot of rouge. Yet even these small gestures mattered. A dusting of powder before heading to work or an evening dance could be transformative. A way to escape the drudgery of labor and step briefly into glamour. Where aristocratic beauty whispered, working-class beauty shouted, "I am still here, still alive, still deserving of admiration, even after 12 hours on my feet." The differences were visible in technique as well as materials. Upper-class women were taught to apply makeup with subtlety. The ideal was to look natural, as though beauty had blossomed effortlessly overnight. Powder must be blended delicately, rouge applied with restraint, lips tinted but never smudged. The art lay in invisibility. To appear painted was to risk social embarrassment. By contrast, working-class women often leaned into bolder application. Their powders might be chalkier, their rouge brighter, their lip colors less discreet, without time for painstaking subtlety. They opted for visible glamour, even if it risked mockery from the refined. This divide created a cultural sneer. What aristocrats called vulgarity, workers called Saturday night. Yet despite these differences, both groups were bound by the same pressure. To look good was to survive socially. For the wealthy, appearance secured status and respectability. For the working classes, it offered a shot at mobility, romance, or simply dignity. A shop girl in a well-powdered face could feel she belonged in the dance hall, her exhaustion hidden under a dusting of rice powder. A scullery maid wiping soot from her hands might keep a single bottle of rosewater tucked away, a reminder that she was more than her apron. Beauty, whether lavish or makeshift, was a way of claiming humanity in a world that judged women first by their looks. Even men noticed the class divide. Satirical magazines mocked working-class women for overusing rouge, depicting them as clowns or seductresses. Aristocrats, meanwhile, were praised for their natural beauty, which, ironically, was every bit as artificial, just more expensive and discreet. Respectability, it seemed, didn't come from what you wore on your face but how much you could afford to hide it. The middle classes sat awkwardly in between, respectable but not aristocratic. Wealthier than workers but not immune to social pressure, they navigated a tricky balancing act. Too much makeup, and they risked accusations of vulgarity. Too little, and they appeared plain. Middle-class women were avid consumers of advertising, buying products that promised to elevate them toward aristocratic refinement without tipping them into ridicule. Their vanity tables were battlegrounds of aspiration, stocked with powders and creams that declared, "We are respectable, but also modern." This stratification of beauty practices underscored the broader Edwardian obsession with appearances as markers of class. Clothing, posture, and accent were obvious indicators, but cosmetics added another layer of distinction. Powder wasn't just powder, it was a signal. The same rouge applied in Belgravia might suggest sophistication. In Whitechapel, it suggested immorality. Context determined meaning, and context, in Edwardian England, always came back to class. And yet, for all the sneering, the line between classes blurred in practice. A working-class woman might save for months to buy a single jar of a fashionable powder, while an aristocratic debutante might secretly admire the boldness of shopgirls' lipstick. Magazines marketed to all levels of society, offering both luxury goods and cheaper imitations. In this way, Cosmetics became one of the few cultural touchpoints shared across class lines. Everyone wanted to be beautiful. How they achieved it simply revealed where they stood on the ladder. The irony of the Edwardian era was that beauty ideals were supposedly universal. Every woman was urged to be pale, rosy, fragrant, and flawless, but the means of achieving them were rigidly divided by class. In truth, beauty was never just about complexion or hair. It was about signaling belonging, aspiration, and status. The face became a billboard of class identity, painted in powder, glossed in rouge, and scented with either luxury perfume or cheap floral water. And so Edwardian women across the spectrum, from duchesses in silk gowns to shop girls in patched dresses, looked into their mirrors and reached for their jars, brushes, and powders. Different tools, different techniques, but the same underlying truth. Appearances were survival. If beauty was a performance, then class determined the budget for costumes, but everyone was still expected to step on stage. When you think of Edwardian beauty, your mind probably jumps to powders, rouges, and perfumes. But hidden behind the vanity jars lurked a whole armory of tools and contraptions. This was the era when modern science collided with personal grooming, producing a wave of gadgets that promised to transform ordinary women into goddesses. The reality? Half of them promised miracles. The other half promised mild electrocution. Let's start with the curling iron. By the Edwardian era, hairstyles were towering, elaborate creations, and taming hair into those soft waves and curls required more than pins and pomade. Enter the curling iron, a heated metal rod clamped around strands to coax them into ringlets or waves. The design was simple and dangerous. These irons were heated in open flames or on hot stoves, which meant they were often scalding by the time they touched hair. Many a fashionable woman ended up with scorched locks or singed scalps, yet the risk didn't stop anyone. The alternative was limp hair that couldn't support a hat the size of a small wagon wheel, and that was unthinkable. Hair tools didn't stop there. There were crimping machines that created tiny waves, rollers that promised volume overnight, and scalp stimulators that supposedly promoted growth. The last were often nothing more than spiky brushes or vibrating combs, guaranteed to leave the user red-faced and tender-headed, but no closer to luscious locks. Advertisements swore these devices would reverse hair loss or add thickness, but most women simply ended up with sore scalps and fewer pennies in their purses. The face was another battleground for gadgeteers. One of the most popular categories of gizmos was the facial massager. Some were simple rollers, metal cylinders you pressed and rolled across the cheeks to stimulate circulation. Others were more elaborate, involving springs, levers, or mechanical vibrations. One particularly memorable device looked like a pair of boxing gloves attached to a motor. You strapped your head into it, and the machine delivered rhythmic punches to your cheeks, promising to restore youthful bloom. If bruises counted as bloom, then it certainly worked. And then there were the suction machines. These bizarre contraptions, sometimes offered in salons and sometimes sold for home use, used small cups attached to pumps to suck at the skin. The idea was that suction would draw out impurities and smooth wrinkles. In practice, they left users looking like they'd just lost a fight with an octopus. Yet, as with many gadgets of the era, the strange marks and discomfort were reframed as proof of effectiveness. If it hurt, tingled, or bruised, it must be working. Electricity was the great Edwardian obsession, and inventors wasted no time applying it to beauty. Battery-powered hairbrushes promised to recharge the scalp. Electrified masks claimed to tone facial muscles. Some gadgets buzzed and whirred as they sent mild shocks through the skin, marketed as scientific rejuvenation. In reality, women were paying handsomely to sit in their parlors and be zapped like experimental frogs. But the language of science was persuasive, and advertisements made these devices sound like the future, an age when beauty could be engineered with wires and volts. Not all gadgets relied on sparks and suction. Simpler tools also had their place on the vanity table. Manicure instruments grew more sophisticated, with specialized scissors, buffers, and cuticle knives. Eyelash curlers, resembling miniature torture devices, clamped lashes into elegant arcs. Metal eyebrow stencils were marketed for the perfect arch. though using them often resulted in brows that looked more startled than seductive. Even the humble powder puff was reinvented, with some models boasting handles, springs, or fancy silk covers to make application seem like a professional ritual, rather than just dabbing your face with fluff. These tools reflected not just vanity but anxiety. The Edwardians were obsessed with aging gracefully, or better yet, not aging at all. Wrinkles, sagging skin, and thinning hair were treated as battles to be fought with technology. If creams and lotions didn't suffice, then surely a clever gadget could. The sheer variety of contraptions on the market testifies to both desperation and hope. Each tool whispered the same promise: beauty could be maintained, restored, or even improved with enough ingenuity. Of course, critics saw through the gimmicks. Satirical magazines lampooned women strapped into vibrating headgear or suction cups, joking that they looked more like science experiments than socialites. Husbands rolled their eyes at the sight of yet another gadget arriving in the post, grumbling about wasted money. But the ridicule didn't stop sales. If anything, it added to the allure. These devices weren't for the ordinary woman. They were for the daring, the fashionable, the modern. The beauty gadget craze also highlighted a shift in culture. For centuries, beauty had been about nature, artifice, or ritual. Now it was about technology. To own a facial massager or an electric comb was to participate in the marvel of the new century. These gizmos weren't just tools, they were symbols of modern life, proof that even beauty had joined the march of progress. A woman zapped by a face current machine could claim she was as up-to-date as a household with electric lights. In hindsight, most of these tools did little more than bruise, burn, or amuse, but they paved the way for future innovations, normalizing the idea that beauty wasn't just powders and perfumes, it was machines, science, and gadgets too. The Edwardian vanity was no longer a static space of jars and brushes. It was becoming a laboratory, buzzing with rollers, curlers, and contraptions that blurred the line between medicine and cosmetics. And so Edwardian women endured their mild shocks, suction bruises, and singed curls, convinced that each new gizmo brought them closer to perfection. Perhaps the results were dubious, but the hope they purchased was real. In a society where appearance meant everything, even the strangest contraption seemed worth a try. After all, what was a little electrocution compared to eternal youth? In the Edwardian world, the line between beauty and health wasn't just blurry, it was practically smudged with rouge. Cosmetics weren't only sold as ways to enhance appearance, they were marketed as quasi-medicines, miracle tonics, and health boosters that promised to fix everything from freckles to fatigue. If your cream didn't cure freckles, it probably just gave you new ones. The Edwardians weren't simply painting their faces, they were swallowing powders, applying potions and rubbing in ointments with the hope that beauty and health could be bottled together. One of the most popular crossovers was the so-called complexion tonic. These bottled liquids, often tinted pink or amber, promised to cleanse the blood, brighten the skin, and banish blemishes. They were advertised as both health supplements and beauty aids. A lady wasn't just improving her looks by sipping them, she was restoring vitality and purifying her constitution. In reality, these tonics often contained alarming ingredients: alcohol, arsenic, or laxatives disguised under flowery names. Many women felt more radiant after a dose, but that might have been the gin talking rather than any genuine improvement in circulation. Lotions and creams leaned heavily on the health angle too. Freckle removers promised to dissolve stubborn blemishes while assuring customers that they were medically approved. Whitening creams boasted about their soothing effects on the skin, even as they packed in lead or mercury. These products blurred the line between doctor's prescription and beauty accessory, wrapped in reassuring language about curative powers. For a society anxious about every wrinkle and spot, the suggestion that your cream doubled as medicine was irresistible. Hair tonics were another booming crossover industry. Bottles lined apothecary shelves, claiming to invigorate the scalp and stimulate growth. Ingredients ranged from harmless oils to stinging concoctions laced with alcohol, camphor, and even sulfur. Men and women alike rubbed these mixtures into their heads with hope and sometimes tears. convinced that tingling meant progress. Advertisers didn't just promise thicker hair, they implied that a healthy scalp was essential to a healthy body, creating a convenient excuse for anyone willing to spend shillings on something that smelled like a bonfire. Even pills got in on the act. Beauty tablets were sold as all-in-one solutions for pale skin, weak nails, or tired eyes. These tablets promised to work from the inside out, often labeled with claims of being blood builders or nerve tonics. They were essentially the Edwardian multivitamin, except with far fewer regulations and far more side effects. Some contained iron, which may have genuinely helped women suffering from anemia. Others contained opiates, which did make you feel better for a while at least, until reality and addiction set in. The crossover between health and beauty wasn't entirely cynical. Part of it stemmed from a cultural belief that outward appearance reflected inner health. A glowing complexion was assumed to signal vitality, while blemishes or sallow skin suggested weak organs or bad blood. This logic made cosmetics and tonics natural partners. Why simply cover up freckles with powder when you could buy a tonic that cured them by fixing your blood at the same time? Of course, the only thing truly cured was the seller's bank balance. Quack doctors thrived in this environment. They hawked electrical belts for slimming the waist, magnetic creams for rejuvenating the skin, and syrups that claimed to brighten the eyes. Some even crossed into dangerous territory, recommending radioactive elements like radium as restoratives. A dab of radioactive face cream was marketed as a way to give your skin a youthful glow. It certainly did glow, though, usually in all the wrong ways. This fusion of beauty and health also fed into the Edwardian obsession with modern science. Electricity, chemistry, and medicine were advancing rapidly, and people trusted anything that sounded vaguely scientific. A cream described as medicinal or a tonic labeled as scientifically formulated was more appealing than a product that admitted to being mere makeup. Women could reassure themselves they weren't indulging in vanity. They were investing in their health. Powder wasn't frivolity if it also nourished the skin. Rouge wasn't deceit if it stimulated circulation. Yet the contradictions were plain. Women chasing health through cosmetics often found themselves feeling worse, not better. Mercury freckle creams left scars. Arsenic wafers left stomach pains. Strong hair tonics caused headaches or fainting. The idea that beauty and health were interchangeable was seductive but dangerous. Still, the narrative persisted because it allowed society to soften the stigma around cosmetics. If makeup was medicine, then wearing it wasn't vanity, it was responsible self-care. The crossover also mirrored larger anxieties about women's roles. Women were expected to look flawless while also embodying moral respectability. By marketing cosmetics as health products, companies gave women permission to purchase and use them without being accused of painting. A jar of cream could be defended as medical, even virtuous. Thus, beauty wasn't just painted on, it was prescribed. By the end of the Edwardian decade, cosmetics and health tonics had become intertwined industries, paving the way for modern cosmeceuticals. Every jar and bottle claimed not just to beautify, but to heal, strengthen, or restore. For many women, this made the purchase easier to justify. After all, who could argue with a product that promised both a youthful glow and improved circulation? And so Edwardian women dabbed their mercury creams, sipped their arsenic tonics, and massaged their scalps with sulfur oils, all under the illusion that they were treating both beauty and health in one. The irony was brutal. In trying to preserve youth and vitality, they often undermined both, but for a society obsessed with appearances, the gamble seemed worth it. If your face looked radiant today, tomorrow's headache was a small price to pay. The Edwardian beauty table may have been stocked in London shops or Paris boutiques, but its ingredients and inspirations came from far beyond the British Isles. Cosmetics were not a purely local invention. They were a collage of global traditions, recipes, and trends. The Edwardians lived in an age of empire and cultural exchange where steamships and telegraphs shrank the world and made exotic goods accessible to those with the money or the ambition to obtain them. A jar of cream wasn't just a jar of cream, it was a passport. Cultural exchange meant your face was basically a United Nations meeting. France led the charge as Europe's undisputed capital of beauty. Parisian perfumers and cosmetic houses like Guerlain, Houbigant, and Pivot had perfected the art of selling allure in a bottle. French powders were famed for their fineness, and French perfumes carried the whiff of sophistication. For an Edwardian woman in Britain, owning a Parisian product was as much about status as scent. You weren't simply powdering your face, you were declaring your cosmopolitan taste, aligning yourself with the elegance of Parisian boulevards rather than the soot of London streets. Many English advertisements shamelessly borrowed French words to lend their products continental glamour, sprinkling in poudre or crème, whether or not the formula was any more French than Yorkshire pudding. Beyond Europe, influences travelled further. Japan in particular fascinated Edwardians, swept up in a craze for Japonisme that extended from art to fashion and beauty. Geisha traditions inspired Western women's fascination with rice powder, prized for its smooth, mattifying finish. Fans and hair ornaments imported from Japan occasionally appeared in Edwardian dressing rooms, lending an air of exotic mystery. Of course, the cultural borrowing was often more romanticized than accurate. Western women weren't painting their faces white like kabuki actors, but they delighted in the idea that their powders carried the wisdom of the East. India contributed too, especially in the form of kohl. Already centuries old in Middle Eastern and South Asian traditions, kohl was adopted by Edwardian women seeking to darken their eyes with an exotic flourish. Its mystique was doubled by the fact that it arrived from faraway lands, advertised as both glamorous and vaguely medicinal. Some salesmen insisted kohl protected against eye strain, a dubious claim, though one that might have helped justify its smudgy appeal. In truth, Edwardians were hardly the first to line their eyes in black, but they were among the first to market it as a worldly luxury rather than a local custom. From the Americas came ingredients that sounded as exotic as they were accessible. Cocoa butter, imported from the Caribbean and South America, became a prized emollient for creams and lotions. Advertisements promised that its softened skin banished dryness and imbued a hint of tropical vitality. Meanwhile, tonics claimed to contain extracts of rare plants from the Amazon or Andes, whether or not those plants had ever seen the inside of the factory. Just saying from South America was enough to conjure visions of jungle secrets bottled for urban boudoirs. The Middle East contributed perfumes and oils, carried by trade networks that were centuries old. Rose oil from Damascus, sandalwood from India, and ambergris from the Arabian coast all found their way into Edwardian perfumes. These ingredients added not just fragrance but narrative. To dab on a scent of rose and musk was to conjure visions of desert caravans and moonlit palaces, romantic fantasies that made an ordinary evening feel like an exotic adventure. Of course, these global influences weren't always authentic. More often than not, they were filtered through layers of advertising hype, distorted by imperialist fantasies. An oriental face cream might contain nothing more exotic than scented petroleum jelly, but the name alone was enough to sell. Cultural appropriation wasn't a phrase Edwardians would have recognized, but they were masters at taking snippets of global traditions and marketing them as fashionable novelties. Still, the fact that these influences were so eagerly adopted reveals something important. Edwardian beauty was becoming globalized. Even women who never left their hometowns could participate in a kind of imagined worldliness through their cosmetics. To dust your face with rice powder, dab on French perfume, and darken your lashes with imported kohl was to build a face that seemed to span continents. It was beauty as travel, without the hassle of steamships or seasickness. The irony, of course, was that much of this cultural borrowing was used to reinforce class divisions at home. Wealthy women flaunted their access to foreign goods, while working-class women made do with cheaper imitations. Owning a French perfume or an Oriental lotion wasn't just about smelling good. It was about proving you had the money, connections, or taste to acquire them. Global beauty trends trickled down, but they trickled unevenly, always leaving the best products perched on the vanities of the rich. There was also a tension between fascination and fear. On the one hand, exotic products were fashionable, On the other, they were sometimes criticized as unnatural or risky. Rumors circulated about coal blinding users or foreign oils irritating the skin. Critics claimed women were endangering themselves with foreign poisons, ignoring the fact that British-made lead powder was just as hazardous. But in Edwardian culture, the exotic always carried both allure and suspicion, a reminder that beauty, like empire, came with complications. By the close of the Edwardian decade, cosmetics were no longer local concoctions passed down from grandmothers. They were part of an interconnected web of global trade, advertising and aspiration. Each jar, each bottle carried not just powder or cream, but a story of Parisian sophistication, Japanese refinement, Indian mystery, or tropical abundance. Whether those stories were true or not hardly mattered. They made women feel part of something larger, something cosmopolitan. And so Edwardian women sat at their vanity tables, assembling their faces from across the globe, a dusting of rice powder, a dab of cocoa butter, a whiff of sandalwood, a trace of French rouge. Their reflections were local, but their beauty routines were international. The Edwardian face was not just a canvas of powders and creams, it was a map of the world. If Edwardian beauty was an elaborate play staged in powder and rouge, then critics were its hecklers, shouting from the gallery that the whole thing was a sham. For every woman carefully arranging her vanity table, there was a moralist writing in the newspaper about how cosmetics would doom civilization. Makeup wasn't just a matter of personal style, it was a cultural battlefield, debated in sermons, editorials, and drawing rooms. Moralists condemned cosmetics as deceitful, sinful, or vulgar. Makeup was lying to men, which is hilarious because men had been lying about mustache wax for years. At the heart of the scandal was the idea of deception. Critics insisted that cosmetics tricked men into falling in love with false beauty. A powdered face or rouged cheek was considered dishonest, a mask that hid a woman's true self. One popular joke suggested that a man should demand his fiancée wash her face before marriage to avoid being swindled. Underneath the humor lay genuine anxiety. If beauty could be purchased in a jar, then how could men trust their eyes or their wives? The fear of being fooled by cosmetics became a recurring theme in Edwardian satire, as though rouge were some elaborate con game played at men's expense. Religious voices added fuel to the fire. Preachers thundered from pulpits that cosmetics were sinful, the tools of vanity and temptation. To paint one's face, they warned, was to reject God's design in favor of human artifice. Some went further, connecting makeup with moral corruption. Painted women were likened to Jezebel, the biblical queen infamous for seduction and destruction. The implication was clear: a woman with carmine on her lips might just be plotting to ruin your soul along with your reputation. Social critics echoed these concerns in secular language, branding cosmetics as vulgar. But to be painted was to associate oneself with actresses, courtesans, and the demi-monde. Respectable women were expected to maintain a natural appearance, though of course natural often meant spending hours applying makeup so discreetly that no one could prove it was there. The hypocrisy was staggering. Women who appeared plain were mocked as dowdy, while those who appeared polished were accused of deceit. It was a tightrope act, and one misstep landed a woman in the gossip columns. Scandals erupted whenever cosmetics crossed into public spectacle. If a society woman appeared at a ball with noticeably rouged cheeks, whispers followed her around the room. If a debutante's lipstick seemed too bold, she risked being labeled fast or improper. Newspapers gleefully reported on such transgressions, treating them as moral dramas. A smudge of rouge could become a scandal, not because it harmed anyone, but because it unsettled social norms about how women were supposed to present themselves. Even medical authorities sometimes joined the chorus of criticism, though often for more practical reasons. Doctors warned about the dangers of lead-based powders and mercury creams, arguing that women were literally poisoning themselves in the pursuit of beauty. Their tone wasn't necessarily sympathetic, however. Many framed the issue as another example of women's foolishness, proof that vanity made them reckless. The criticism was less about protecting women's health than about mocking their priorities. And then there were the husbands. Memoirs and letters of the period are filled with grumbling men who complained about powder on their coat collars, rouge smudges on their handkerchiefs, or the overwhelming scent of perfume in the theatre. These domestic grievances were framed as evidence that cosmetics were not only deceitful but inconvenient. Some men declared they would never marry a woman who wore makeup, while simultaneously swooning over actresses whose faces were caked in powder. The contradiction was almost comical, if not so persistent. But women were not silent in the face of criticism. Many defended their use of cosmetics as harmless, even empowering. They argued that men had no problem with artifice when it came to tailored suits, polished boots, or carefully waxed mustaches. Why should women be condemned for painting their cheeks when men literally oiled their facial hair into gravity-defying curls? Beauty, women insisted, was not deceit, it was self-presentation, a way to claim dignity in a society that judged them mercilessly on appearances. Some women even embraced the controversy, wearing cosmetics boldly as a form of defiance. Suffragettes, actresses and social rebels used makeup to provoke as much as to beautify. By painting their faces, they challenged the very idea that respectability meant being natural. If society called them deceitful, they answered by doubling down on rouge. In this way, cosmetics became both scandal and statement. A small jar of powder could ignite a cultural argument about morality, class, and gender. The criticism, ironically, only fueled the allure of cosmetics. Anything scandalous carries a whiff of excitement, and makeup was no exception. To wear rouge was to flirt with impropriety, to risk whispers and sidelong glances. For many women, that thrill was part of the appeal. Cosmetics were not just about looking beautiful, they were about feeling daring, stepping slightly outside the boundaries of what was expected. By the end of the Edwardian decade, the debate showed no sign of resolution. Critics still scolded, moralists still sermonized, and satirists still joked about painted women. But the jars kept selling, the powders kept puffing, and the rouge kept glowing on cheeks in every ballroom. Scandal had not destroyed cosmetics, it had made them more powerful. The very fact that makeup could cause such uproar proved how much it mattered, and so Edwardian women faced their mirrors with brushes in hand, fully aware of the criticism swirling outside. They powdered, rouged, and perfumed anyway. If makeup was a scandal, then it was one they were willing to wear on their faces. After all, what's a little controversy when your cheeks look radiant? By the final years of the Edwardian era, a new force was creeping into the world of beauty, one that would outshine theatre, defy the critics, and eventually reshape global fashion, cinema. Moving pictures were still young, flickering curiosities shown in Nickelodeons or rented halls, but their impact on cosmetics was immediate. For the first time, women could not only see beauty ideals on stage or in photographs, but watch them move, smile, and flutter their lashes across a giant screen. The effect was hypnotic. If Hollywood said rouge was in, suddenly every parlor looked like a tomato processing plant. Unlike theatre, which required heavy makeup for visibility under gaslight, cinema had its own peculiar demands. Early film stock was unforgiving. It exaggerated shine, flattened features, and made pale faces ghost-like. To counter this, actresses applied powder, rouge, and kohl in ways tailored for the camera. The results looked exaggerated up close, but on screen they translated into luminous beauty. Women watching from the audience quickly noticed, if a powdered face could dazzle on film, why shouldn't the same tricks work at the next garden party? The new medium also introduced a fresh type of celebrity. Theatre stars were glamorous, but they belonged to particular cities or tours. Film stars, however, were everywhere. Their images could be seen in London, Paris, or New York simultaneously, projected larger than life onto the silver screen. Suddenly, cosmetics weren't just fashion, they were international fashion. A woman in Manchester could mimic the style of an actress she'd never meet. Her vanity table transformed into a personal movie set. Rouge became especially popular thanks to film. On screen, pale cheeks disappeared, but a splash of color made features pop. Actresses with rosy cheeks looked vibrant and youthful, and audiences wanted to replicate the effect. Theatres might have mocked rouge as vulgar, but film made it glamorous. Sales of blush skyrocketed, and even women who swore they would never paint found themselves sneaking carmine into their shopping baskets. After all, if it looked good on the big screen, surely it would look good under the glow of a gas lamp. Lipstick, too, benefited from cinema's glow. While still somewhat scandalous in polite society, lipstick on film looked daring and modern. Close-ups of actresses with defined mouths made the look irresistible. Women began experimenting, tinting their lips in bolder shades, emboldened by the idea that movie stars whose images filled shop windows and postcards were doing the same. The notion that makeup was deceitful began to crumble under the sheer glamour projected in flickering reels. If painted lips could captivate audiences, why shouldn't they captivate suitors? Eye makeup, always a delicate subject, also found new champions in film. Kohl-rimmed eyes made actresses' gazes smolder on screen, where unlined eyes risked looking blank or washed out. Women who might once have dismissed kohl as foreign or theatrical now saw it as cinematic and modern. A dab of dark powder at the lash line could make an ordinary gaze look film star intense. As actresses' portraits appeared in newspapers and promotional posters, women eagerly adopted the look, even if it raised eyebrows at church. The influence of cinema wasn't limited to products. It extended to ideals of beauty itself. Theatre had celebrated grand gestures and exaggerated features, but film rewarded subtlety. The camera captured tiny movements, a flicker of the eye, a faint smile, the soft curve of a cheek. Beauty shifted toward delicacy, toward a more intimate style that audiences could believe in. Cosmetics adapted accordingly. Powders promised natural mattes, rouge promised healthy glow, and lipsticks promised subtle charm. Even as women applied more makeup, the goal was to appear effortless, as though the screen's enchantment simply radiated from within. Of course, not everyone approved. Moralists who had wrung their hands over rouge on stage now wailed about rouge on film, warning that cinema spread immorality faster than influenza. They fretted that shopgirls and housemaids were imitating painted stars, bringing scandalous habits into respectable homes. Yet their protests only amplified the allure. The more critics condemned cinema beauty, the more women flocked to it, eager to share in the glamour of modernity. Film also democratized cosmetics in ways theatre never had. Tickets were cheap, allowing working-class women to watch the same stars as duchesses. They might not afford the same gowns, but a tin of rouge or a stick of lipstick was within reach. For the first time, beauty ideals transcended strict class lines. Cosmetics became not just the property of the wealthy, but a shared aspiration across society. In this sense, the cinema was not just entertainment, it was a beauty school for the masses. Magazines quickly capitalized on the trend, printing interviews with actresses about their beauty secrets. Of course, these secrets often involved endorsing specific powders or creams conveniently available for purchase. The synergy between cinema and advertising was born. A star's glowing complexion on screen translated directly into sales off-screen. Beauty companies realized they no longer needed to invent fictional doctors for endorsements. Real, flesh-and-blood celebrities would do the job better. By the close of the Edwardian decade, cinema had begun reshaping the beauty landscape permanently. It shifted cosmetics from the shadows of scandal to the spotlight of glamour. It gave women new role models, new techniques, and new permission to experiment. The vanity table was no longer just a private ritual. It was a stage where every woman could imagine herself as a star, and so Edwardian women lined up at Nickelodeons, watched their favorite actresses flutter lashes and pout lips, and went home determined to recreate the magic. Their powders, rouge, and kohl were no longer just tools of appearance. They were tickets into the glamorous, glowing world of cinema. For the first time, beauty wasn't just a mirror of society. It was a projection, flickering in black and white, teaching an entire generation how to shine. When the Edwardian decade flickered to a close in 1910, few could have guessed how much its beauty habits would ripple across the 20th century and beyond. It was a time of transition, a bridge between the prudish moralism of the Victorians and the bold experimentation of the Jazz Age. Cosmetics, once whispered about as vulgar or sinful, had moved into mainstream culture thanks to actresses, suffragettes, global trade, and the irresistible glow of cinema. What had once been scandal was fast becoming standard, from arsenic wafers to contour kits. The tools changed, the obsession didn't. One of the most enduring legacies of Edwardian cosmetics was normalization. The very act of buying a powder compact or a jar of cold cream stopped being a guilty secret and became a daily necessity. Even though critics still muttered about painted women, the fact remained, cosmetics were here to stay. By the 1920s, women didn't just dab at powders, they carried compacts in their handbags, pulling them out in public with pride. That everyday casualness, the idea that beauty could be portable, even flaunted, was born in the Edwardian boudoir. The era also laid the groundwork for the global beauty industry. Advertising turned cosmetics into commodities, and cinema gave them celebrity endorsement before the word even existed. The partnerships between film stars and cosmetic companies in the decades to come, think Clara Bow's lipstick or Max Factor's Hollywood empire, were direct descendants of Edwardian innovations. The clever use of posters, postcards, and magazine spreads during the 1900s had taught the industry a priceless lesson: sell not the product but the fantasy. Another lasting influence was the expansion of what beauty meant. Victorian ideals had restricted women to natural modesty, but Edwardians experimented with every part of the body: hair, nails, skin, eyes, and even scent. That idea that no detail was too small to perfect shaped the beauty routines of the modern era. Today's shelves, groaning with serums, palettes, and masks, can trace their DNA back to Edwardian vanity tables piled with powders, rouge, oils, and strange little gadgets that buzzed or burned. Of course, not everything was a triumph. The Edwardians left behind a cautionary tale about safety. Their reliance on lead powders, mercury creams, and arsenic tonics highlighted the dangers of unregulated beauty. It took tragedies and scandals to push governments toward regulation in the decades that followed. Modern laws requiring ingredient labels, safety testing, and bans on toxic substances owe their origins to those poisoned Edwardian complexions. In other words, the price of porcelain skin was not just paid by the women of the time, it shaped consumer protection for generations to come. Perhaps the most profound legacy, however, was the idea that beauty was both performance and identity. Edwardian women learned to construct themselves through cosmetics, to present not just a face but a persona. A powdered cheek could signal class, a dab of kohl could whisper rebellion, a slick of rouge could announce modernity. This performative aspect of beauty carried into the 20th century, fueling everything from the flappers' painted lips to the Hollywood glamour queens of the 1940s. The face became not just something you were born with, but something you could build. And that idea didn't stop with women, though men in the Edwardian era mostly confined themselves to mustache wax and pomades. The seeds were sown for broader conversations about male grooming and eventually cosmetics. If Edwardian women could normalize powder puffs and lip tints, the century ahead would eventually see men reach for concealers and creams without fear of scandal. The Edwardian decade cracked the first fissures in gendered beauty, even if it would take decades for those cracks to widen.